Chapter 10. The Dawn and His Daughter. Professor Braddock was usually the most methodical of men, and timed his life by the clock and the almanac. He rose at 7, summer and winter, to partake of a hearty breakfast, which served him until dinner came at 5:30. Braddock dined at this unusual hour, save when there was company, as he did not eat any luncheon and scorned the very idea of afternoon tea. 2 meals a day, he maintained, was enough for any man who led a sedentary life, as too much food was apt to clog the wheels of the intellect. He usually worked in his museum, if the indulgence of his hobby could be called work, from 9 until 4, after which hour he took a short walk in the garden or through the village. On finishing his dinner, he would glance over some scientific publication, or perhaps by way of recreation, play a game or two of patience. But at 7, he invariably retired into his own rooms to renew work. Retirement to bed took place at midnight, so it can be guessed that the professor got through an enormous quantity of work during the year. A more methodical man or a more industrious man did not exist. But on occasions, even this enthusiast wearied of his hobby and of the year's routine. A longing to see brother scientists of his own way of thinking would seize him, and he would abruptly depart for London to occupy quiet lodgings and indulge in intercourse with his fellow men. Braddock rarely gave early intimation of his urban nostalgia. At breakfast, he would suddenly announce that the fit took him to go to London, and he would drive to Jessam along with Cockatoo to catch the 10 o'clock train to London. Sometimes he sent the Kanaka back. At other times, he would take him to town. But whether Cockatoo remained or departed, the museum was always locked up, lest it should be profaned by the servants of the house. As a matter of fact, Braddock need not have been afraid, for Lucy, knowing her stepfather's whims and violent temper, took care that the sanctity of the place should remain inviolate. Sometimes the professor came back in a couple of days. At times, his absence would extend to a week, and on 2 or 3 occasions he remained absent for a fortnight. But whenever he returned, he said very little about his doings to Lucy, perhaps deeming that dry scientific details would not appeal to a lively young lady. As soon as he was established in his museum again, life at the pyramids would resume its usual routine, until Braddock again felt the want of a change. The wonder was, considering the nature of his work and the closeness of his application, that he did not more often indulge in these bohemian wanderings.
Lucy, therefore, was not astonished when, on the morning after her visit to Mrs. Jasher, the professor announced in his usual abrupt way that he intended to go to London, but would leave Cockatoo in charge of his precious collection. She was somewhat disturbed, however, as, wishing to forward the widow's matrimonial aims, she had invited her to dinner for the ensuing night. This she told her stepfather, and, rather to her surprise, he expressed himself sorry that he could not remain. "Mrs. Jasher," said Braddock hastily, drinking his coffee, "is a very sensible woman who knows when to be silent." "She is also a good housekeeper, I believe," hinted Miss Kendall demurely. "Eh, what? Well, why do you say that?" snapped Braddock sharply. Lucy fenced. "Mrs. Jasher admires you, father." Braddock grunted, but did not seem displeased, since even a scientist possessing the usual vanity of the male is not inaccessible to flattery. "Did Mrs. Jasher tell you this?" he inquired, smiling complacently. "Not in so many words. Still, I am a woman, and can guess how much another woman leaves unsaid." Lucy paused, then added significantly, "I do not think that she is so very old, and you must admit that she is wonderfully well preserved." "Like a mummy," remarked the professor absently, then pushed back his chair to add briskly, "What does all this mean, you minx? I know that the woman is all right so far as a woman can be, but her confounded age and her looks and her unexpressed admiration, what are these to an old man like myself?" "Father," said Lucy earnestly, "when I marry Archie, I shall, in all probability, leave Gartley for London." I know. Bless me, child. Do you think that I have not thought of that? If you were only wise, which you are not, you would marry random and remain at the fort. Sir Frank has other fish to fry, father, and even if I did remain at the fort as his wife, I still could not look after you." "Humph, I am beginning to see what you are driving at. But I can't forget your mother, my dear. She was a good wife to me." "Still," said Lucy coaxingly, and becoming more and more the champion of Mrs. Jasher, "you cannot manage this large house by yourself. I do not like to leave you in the hands of servants when I marry. Mrs. Jasher is very domesticated and would make a good housekeeper. No, I don't want to give you another mother, child." "There is no danger of that, even if I did not marry," rejoined Lucy stiffly. "A girl can have only one mother." "And a man apparently can have 2 wives," said Braddock with dry humor. "Humph!" He pinched his plump chin. "It's not a bad idea, but of course I can't fall in love at my age." "I don't think that Mrs. Jasher asks for impossibilities." The professor rose briskly. "I'll think over it," said he. "Meanwhile, I am going to London." "When will you be back, Father?" "I can't say. Don't ask silly questions. I dislike being bound to time. I may be a week, and I may be only a few days. Things can go on here as usual, but if Hope comes to see you, ask Mrs. Jasher in to play chaperone." Lucy consented to this suggestion, and Braddock went away to prepare for his departure. To get him off the premises was like launching a ship, as the entire household was at his swift heels, packing boxes, strapping rugs, cutting sandwiches, helping him on with his overcoat, and assisting him into the trap, which had been hastily sent for to the Warrior Inn. All the time Braddock talked and scolded and gave directions and left instructions, until everyone was quite bewildered. Lucy and the servants all sighed with relief when they saw the trap disappear round the end of the road in the direction of Jessam. In addition to being a famous archaeologist, the professor was assuredly a great nuisance to those who had to do with his whims and fancies. For the next 2 or 3 days, Lucy enjoyed herself in a quiet way with Archie. In spite of the lateness of the season, the weather was still fine, and the artist took the opportunity of the pale sunshine to sketch a great deal of the marsh scenery. Lucy attended him as a rule when he went abroad, and sometimes Mrs. Jasher, voluble and merry, would come along with them to play the part of chaperone. But the girl noticed that Mrs. Jasher's merriment was forced at times, and in the searching morning light she appeared to be quite old. Wrinkles showed themselves on her plump face, and weary lines appeared round her mouth. Also, she was absent-minded, while the lovers chattered, and, when spoken to, would return to the present moment with a start. As the widow was now well off as regards money, and as her scheme to marry Braddock was well on the way to success, for Lucy had duly reported the professor's attitude, it was difficult to understand why Mrs. Jasher should look so worried. One day Lucy spoke to her on the subject. Random had strolled across the marshes to look at Hope's sketch, and the 2 men chatted together while Miss Kendall led the little widow to one side. "There is nothing the matter, I hope," said Lucy gently. "No? Why do you say that?" asked Mrs. Jasher, flushing. "You have been looking worried for the last few days." "I have a few troubles," sighed the widow. "Troubles connected with the estate of my late brother. The lawyers are very disagreeable, and make all sorts of difficulties to swell their costs. Then, strangely enough, I am beginning to feel my brother's death more than I thought I should have done. You see that I am in mourning, dear. After what you said the other day, I felt that it was wrong for me not to wear mourning. Of course, my poor brother and I were almost strangers. All the same, as he has left me money and was my only relative, I think it right to show some grief. I am a lonely woman, my dear." "When my father comes back, you will no longer be lonely," said Lucy. "I hope not. I feel that I want a man to look after me. I told you that I desired to marry the professor for his possible title and in order to form a salon and have some amusement and power. But also I want a companion for my old age. There is no denying," added Mrs. Jasher with another sigh, "that I am growing old in spite of all the care I take. I am grateful for your friendship, dear. At one time I thought that you did not like me." "Oh, I think we get on very well together," said Lucy somewhat evasively, for she did not want to say that she would make the widow an intimate friend. "And as you know, I am quite pleased that you should marry my stepfather." "So pleasant to think that you look at my ambition in that light," said Mrs. Jasher, patting the girl's arm. "When does the professor return?" "I cannot say. He refused to fix a date, but he usually remains away for a fortnight. I expect him back in that time, but he may come much earlier. He will come back when the fancy takes him." "I shall alter all that when we are married," muttered Mrs. Jasher with a frown. "He must be taught to be less selfish." "I fear you will never improve him in that respect," said Lucy dryly, and rejoined the gentleman in time to hear Random mention the name of Don Pedro de Gallangos. "What is that, Sir Frank?" she asked. Random turned toward her with his pleasant smile. "My Spanish friend, whom I met at Genoa, is coming here tomorrow." "With his daughter?" questioned Mrs. Jasher roguishly. "Of course," replied the young soldier, coloring. "Donna Inez is quite devoted to her father and never leaves him." "She will one day, I expect," said Hope innocently, for his eyes were on his sketch and not on Random's face, "when the husband of her choice comes along." "Perhaps he has come along already," tittered Mrs. Jasher significantly. Lucy took pity on Random's confusion. "Where will they stay?" "At the Warrior Inn. I have engaged the best rooms in the place. I fancy they will be comfortable there, as Mrs. Humber, the landlady, is a good housekeeper and an excellent cook, and I don't think Don Pedro is hard to please." "A Spaniard, you say?" remarked Archie idly. "Does he speak English?" "Admirably. So does the daughter." "But why does a Spaniard come to so out-of-the-way a place?" asked Mrs. Jasher after a pause. "I thought I told you the other day, when we spoke of the matter," answered Sir Frank, with surprise. "Don Pedro has come here to interview Professor Braddock about that missing mummy." Hope looked up sharply. "What does he know about the mummy?" "Nothing so far as I know, save that he came to Europe with the intention of purchasing it and found himself forestalled by Professor Braddock. Don Pedro told me no more than that." "Humph," murmured Hope to himself. "Don Pedro will be disappointed when he learns that the mummy is missing." Random did not catch the words and was about to ask him what he had said, when two tall figures, conducted by a shorter one, were seen moving on the white road which led to the fort. "Strangers," said Mrs. Jasher, putting up her lorgnette, which she used for effect, although she had remarkably keen sight. "How do you know?" asked Lucy carelessly. "My dear, look how oddly the man is dressed." "I can't tell at this distance," said Lucy, "and if you can, Mrs. Jasher, I really do not see why you require glasses." Mrs. Jasher laughed at the compliment to her sight and colored through her rouge at the reproof to her vanity. Meanwhile, the smaller figure, which was that of a village lad leading a tall gentleman and a slender lady, pointed toward the group round Hope's easel. Shortly, the boy ran back up to the village road, and the gentleman came along the pathway with the lady. Random, who had been looking at them intently, suddenly started, having at length recognized them. "Don Pedro and his daughter," he said in an astonished voice, and sprang forward to welcome the unexpected visitors. "Now, my dear," whispered the widow in Lucy's ear, "we shall see the kind of woman Sir Frank prefers to you." "Well, as Sir Frank has seen the kind of man I prefer to him," retorted Lucy, "that makes us quite equal." "I am glad these newcomers talk English," said Hope, who had risen to his feet. "I know nothing of Spanish." "They are not Spanish, but Peruvian," said Mrs. Jasher. "The language is the same, more or less." "Confound it! Here is Random, bringing them here. I wish he would take them to the fort. There's no more work for the next hour, I suppose." And Hope, rather annoyed, began to pack his artistic traps. On a nearer view, Don Pedro proved to be a tall, lean, dry man, not unlike Dora's conception of Don Quixote. He must have had Indian blood in his veins, judging from his very dark eyes, his stiff, lank hair, worn somewhat long, and his high cheekbones. Also, although he was arrayed in puritanic black, his barbaric love of color betrayed itself in a red tie and in a scarlet handkerchief, which was twisted loosely round a soft slouch hat. It was the hat and the brilliant red of tie and handkerchief which had caught Mrs. Jasher's eye at so great a distance, and which had led her to pronounce the man a stranger, for Mrs. Jasher well knew that no Englishman would affect such vivid tints. All the same, in spite of this eccentricity, Don Pedro looked a thorough Castilian gentleman, and bowed gravely when presented to the ladies by Random. "Mrs. Jasher, Miss Kendall, permit me to present Don Pedro de Gallegos." "I am charmed," said the Peruvian, bowing, hat in hand, "and in turn, allow me, ladies, to introduce my daughter, Donna Inez de Gallegos." Archie was also presented to the Don and to the young lady, after which Lucy and Mrs. Jasher, while not appearing to look, made a thorough examination of the lady with whom Random was in love. No doubt Donna Inez was making an examination on her own account, and with the cleverness of the sex, the three women, while chatting affably, learned all that there was to be learned from the outward appearance of each other in 3 minutes. Miss Kendall could not deny but what Donna Inez was very beautiful, and frankly admitted, inwardly, of course, her own inferiority. She was merely pretty, whereas the Peruvian lady was truly handsome and quite majestic in appearance. Yet about Donna Inez there was the same indefinite barbaric look as characterized her father. Her face was lovely, dark, and proud in expression, but there was an aloofness about it which puzzled the English girl. Donna Inez might have belonged to a race populating another planet of the solar system. She had large, black, melting eyes, a straight Greek nose and perfect mouth, a well-rounded chin and magnificent hair, dark and glossy as the wing of the raven, which was arranged in the latest Parisian style of coiffure. Also, her gown, as the two women guessed in an instant, was from Paris. She was perfectly gloved and booted, and even if she betrayed somehow a barbaric taste for color in the dull, ruddy hue of her dress, which was subdued with black braid, yet she looked quite a well-bred woman. All the same, her whole appearance gave an observant onlooker the idea that she would be more at home in a scanty robe and glittering with rudely wrought ornaments of gold. Perhaps Peru, where she came from, suggested the comparison, but Lucy's thoughts flew back to an account of the Virgins of the Sun, which the professor had once described. It occurred to her, perhaps wrongly, that in Donna Inez she beheld one who in former days would have been the bride of some gorgeous Inca. "I fear you will find England dull after the sunshine of Lima," said Lucy, having ended a swift examination. Donna Inez shivered a trifle and glanced around at the gray, misty air, through which the pale sunshine struggled with difficulty. "I certainly prefer the tropics to this," she said in musical English, "but my father has come down here on business, and until it is concluded we shall remain in this place." "Then we must make things as bright as possible for you," said Mrs. Jasher cheerfully, and desperately anxious to learn more of the newcomers. "You must come to see me, Donna Inez. Yonder is my cottage." "Thank you, madame, you are very good." Meanwhile, Don Pedro was talking to the two young men. "Yes, I did arrive here earlier than I expected," he was remarking, "but I have to return to Lima shortly, and I wish to get my business with Professor Braddock finished as speedily as possible." "I am sorry," said Lucy politely, "but my father is absent." "And when will he return, Miss Kendall?" "I can scarcely say in a week or a fortnight." Don Pedro made a gesture of annoyance. "It is a pity, as I am so very pressed for time. Still, I must remain until the professor returns. I am so anxious to hear if the mummy has been found." "It is not found yet," said Hope quickly, "and never will be." Don Pedro looked at him quietly. "It must be found," said he. "I have come all the way from Lima to obtain it. When you hear my story, you will not be surprised at my desire to regain the mummy." "Regain it?" echoed Hope and Random in one breath. Don Pedro nodded. "The mummy was stolen from my father," he said. Chapter 11. The Manuscript. It was certainly strange how constantly the subject of the missing mummy came uppermost. Since it had disappeared, and since the man who had brought it to England was dead, it might have been thought that nothing more would be said about the matter. But Professor Braddock harped incessantly on his loss, which was perhaps natural, and Widow Anne also talked a great deal as to the possibility of the mummy being found, as she hoped to learn by that means the name of the assassin who had strangled her poor boy. Now Don Pedro de Gallegos appeared with the strange information that the weird relic of Peruvian civilization had been stolen from his father. Apparently, fate was not inclined to let the matter of the lost mummy drop, and was working round to a denouement, which would possibly include the solution of the mystery of Sidney Bolton's death. Yet, on the face of it, there appeared to be no chance of the truth becoming known. Of course, when Don Pedro announced that the mummy had formerly belonged to his father, everyone was anxious to hear how it had been stolen. The Gallegos family were established in Lima, and the embalmed body of Inca Caxus had been purchased from a gentleman residing in Malta. How, then, had it crossed the water, and how had Don Pedro learned its whereabouts, only to arrive too late to secure his missing property? Mrs. Jasher was especially anxious to learn these things, and explained her reasons to Lucy. "You see, my dear," she said to the girl on the day after Don Pedro's arrival in Gartley, "if we learn the past of that horrid mummy, we may gain a clue to the person who desired possession of the nasty thing, and so may hunt down this terrible criminal. Once he is found, the mummy may be secured again, and should I be able to return it to your father, out of gratitude he would certainly marry me." "You seem to think that the assassin is a man," said Lucy dryly, "yet you forget that the person who talked to Sidney through the window of the Sailor's Rest was a woman." "An old woman," emphasized Mrs. Jasher briskly. "Quite so," Lucy contradicted. Eliza Flight did not say if the woman was old or young, but merely stated that she wore a dark dress and a dark shawl over her head. Still, this mysterious woman was connected in some way with the murder, else she would not have been speaking to Sidney. "I don't follow you, my dear. You talk as though poor Mr. Bolton expected to be murdered. For my part, I hold by the verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. The truth is to be found, if anywhere, in the past of the mummy." "We can discover nothing about that." "You forget what Don Pedro said, my dear," remarked Mrs. Jasher hastily, "that the mummy had been stolen from his father. Let us hear what he has to say, and we may find a clue. I am anxious that the professor should regain the green mummy, for reasons which you know of. And now, my dear, can you come to dinner tonight?" "Well, I don't know." Miss Kendall hesitated. "Archie said that he would look in this evening." "I shall ask Mr. Hope also, my love. Don Pedro is coming, and his daughter likewise. Needless to say, Sir Frank will follow the young lady. We shall be a party of 6, and after dinner we must induce Don Pedro to relate the story of how the mummy was stolen." "He may not be inclined." "Oh, I think so," replied Mrs. Jasher quickly. "He wants to get the mummy back again, and if we discuss the subject, we may see some chance of securing it. But Don Pedro will not wish it to be restored to my father." Mrs. Jasher shrugged her plump shoulders. "Your father and Don Pedro can arrange that themselves. All I desire is that the mummy should be found. Undoubtedly, it belongs by purchase to the professor, but as it has been stolen, this Peruvian gentleman may claim it." "Well, I shall come, and Archie also," assented Lucy, who was beginning to be interested in the matter. "The affair is somewhat romantic." "Criminal, my dear, criminal," said Mrs. Jasher, rising to take her leave. "It is not a matter I care to mix myself up with. Still," she laughed, "you know why I am doing so." "If I had to take all this trouble to gain a husband," observed Lucy somewhat acidly, "I should remain single all my life." "If you were as lonely as I am," retorted the plump widow, "you would do your best to secure a man-toy look after you. I should prefer a young and handsomer husband, such as Sir Frank Random, for instance. But as beggars cannot be choosers, I must content myself with old age, a famous scientist, and the chance of a possible title. Now mind, dear, tonight at 7, not a minute later." And she bustled away to prepare for the reception of her guests. It seemed to Lucy that Mrs. Jasher was taking a great deal of trouble to become Mrs. Braddock, especially as the professor's brother might live for many a long day yet, in which case the widow would not gain the title she coveted for years. However, the girl rather sympathized with Mrs. Jasher, who was a companionable soul and fond of society. Circumstances condemned her to a somewhat lonely life in an isolated cottage in a rather dull neighborhood, so it was little to be wondered at that she should strive to move heaven and earth, as she was doing, in the hope of escaping from her solitude. Besides, although Miss Kendall did not wish to make a close companion of the widow, yet she did not dislike her, and moreover thought that she would make Professor Braddock a very presentable wife. Thinking thus, Lucy was quite willing to forward Mrs. Jasher's plans by inducing Don Pedro to tell all he knew about this missing mummy. Thus it came about that 6 people assembled in the tiny pink parlor of Mrs. Jasher at the hour of 7 o'clock. It required dexterous management to seat the whole company in the dining room, which was only a trifle larger than the parlor. However, Mrs. Jasher contrived to place them round her hospitable board in a fairly comfortable fashion, and, once seated, the dinner was so good that no one felt the drawbacks of scanty elbow room. The widow, as hostess, was placed at the head of the table, Don Pedro, as the eldest of the men, at the foot, and Sir Frank, with Donna Inez, faced Archie and Lucy Kendall. Jane, who was well instructed in waiting by her mistress, attended to her duties admirably, acting both as footman and butler. Lucy, indeed, had offered Mrs. Jasher the services of cockatoo to hand round the wine, but the widow, with a pretty shudder, had declined. "That dreadful creature with his yellow mop of hair gives me the shivers," she declared, "considering the isolation of the district and the narrow limits of Mrs. Jasher's income, the meal was truly admirable, being well cooked and well served, while the table was arrayed like an altar for the reception of the various dishes. Whatever Mrs. Jasher might be as an adventuress, she certainly proved herself to be a capital housekeeper, and Lucy foresaw that, if she did become Mrs. Braddock, the professor would fare sumptuously for the rest of his scientific life. When the meal was ended, the widow produced a box of superfine cigars and another of cigarettes, after which she left the gentlemen to sip their wine, and took her 2 young friends to chatter chiffons in the tiny parlor. And it said much for Mrs. Jasher's methodical ways that, considering the limited space, everything went, as the saying goes, like clockwork. Likewise, the widow had proved herself a wonderful hostess, as she kept the ball of conversation rolling briskly and induced a spirit of fraternity, uncommon in an ordinary dinner party. During the meal, Mrs. Jasher had kept off the subject of the mummy, which was the excuse for the entertainment, but when the gentlemen strolled into the parlor, feeling well fed and happy, she hinted at Don Pedro's quest. As the night was cold and the Peruvian gentleman came from the tropics, he was established in a well-padded armchair close to the sea-coal fire, and with her own fair hands, Mrs. Jasher gave him a cup of fragrant coffee, which was rendered still more agreeable to the palate by the introduction of a vanilla bean. With this and with a good cigar, for the ladies gave the gentlemen permission to smoke. Don Pedro felt very happy and easy, and complimented Mrs. Jasher warmly on her capability of making her fellow creatures comfortable. "It is altogether comfortable, madame," said Don Pedro, rising to make a courtly bow. In fact, so agreeable was the foreigner that Mrs. Jasher dreamed for one swift moment of throwing over the dry-as-dust scientist to become a Spanish lady of Lima. "You flatter me, Don Pedro," she said, waving a wholly unnecessary fan out of compliment to her guest's Spanish extraction. "Indeed, I am very glad that you are pleased with my poor little house." "Pardon, madame, but no house can be poor when it is a casket to contain such a jewel." "There," said Lucy somewhat satirically to the young men, while Mrs. Jasher blushed and bridled. "What Englishman could turn such a compliment? It reminds one of Georgian times. We are more sober now than my fathers were then," said Hope, smiling, "and I am sure if Random thought for a few minutes he could produce something pretty. Go on, Random." "My brain is not equal to the strain after dinner," said Sir Frank. As for Donna Inez, she did not speak, but sat smiling quietly in her corner of the room, looking remarkably handsome. As a young girl, Lucy was pretty, and Mrs. Jasher was a comely widow, but neither one had the majestic looks of the Spanish lady. She smiled, a veritable queen amidst the gimcrack ornaments of Mrs. Jasher's parlor, and Sir Frank, who was fathoms deep in love, could not keep his eyes off her face. For a few minutes the conversation was frivolous, quite the Shakespeare and musical glasses kind of speech. Then Mrs. Jasher, who had no idea that her good dinner should be wasted in charming nothings, introduced the subject of the mummy by a reference to Professor Braddock. It was characteristic of her cleverness that she did not address Don Pedro, but pointed her speech at Lucy Kendall. "I do hope your father will return with that mummy," she observed, after a dexterous allusion to the late tragedy. "I don't think he has gone to look for it," replied Miss Kendall indifferently. "But surely he desired to get it back after paying nearly £1,000 for it," said Mrs. Jasher, with well-feigned astonishment. "Oh, of course, but he would scarcely look for it in London." "Has Professor Braddock gone to search for the mummy?" asked Don Pedro. "No," answered Lucy. "He is visiting the British Museum to make some researches in the Egyptian department." "When do you expect him back, please?" Lucy shrugged her shoulders. "I can't say, Don Pedro. My father comes and goes as the whim takes him." The Spanish gentleman looked thoughtfully into the fire. "I shall be glad to see the professor when he returns," he said in his excellent, slow-sounding English. "My concern about this mummy is deep." "Dear me," remarked Mrs. Jasher, shielding her fair cheek with the unnecessary fan, and venturing on a joke. "Is the mummy a relative?" "Yes, madame," replied Don Pedro, gravely and unexpectedly. At this everyone, very naturally, looked astonished. That is, all save Donna Inez, who still preserved her fixed smile. Mrs. Jasher took a mental note of the same, and decided that the young lady was not very intelligent. Meanwhile, Don Pedro continued his speech after a glance round the circle. "I have the blood of the royal Inca race in my veins," he said with pride. "Ha!" murmured the widow to herself. "Then that accounts for your love of color, which is so un-English." Then she raised her voice. "Tell us all about it, Don Pedro," she entreated. "We are usually so dull here that a romantic story excites us dreadfully." "I do not know that it is very romantic," said Don Pedro with a polite smile, "and if you will not find it dull—" "Oh, no," said Archie, who was as anxious as Mrs. Jasher to hear what was to be said about the mummy. "Come, sir, we are all attention." Don Pedro bowed again, and again swept the circle with his deep-set eyes. "The Inca Caxus," he remarked, "was one of the decadent rulers of ancient Peru. At the conquest by the Spaniards, Inca Atahualpa was murdered by Pizarro, as you probably know. Inca Taparca succeeded him as a puppet king. He died also, and it was suspected that he was slain by a native chief called Chalcuchima. Then Manco succeeded, and is looked upon by historians as the last Inca of Peru, but he was not." "This is news indeed," said Random lazily. "And who was the last Inca?" "The man who is now the green mummy." "Inca Caxus," ventured Lucy timidly. Don Pedro looked at her sharply. "How do you come to know the name?" "You mentioned it just now, but before that I heard my father mention it," said Lucy, who was surprised at the sharpness of his tone. "And where did the professor learn the name?" asked Don Pedro anxiously. Lucy shook her head. "I cannot say. But go on with the story," she continued, with the naive curiosity of a child. "Yes, do," pleaded Mrs. Jasher, who was listening with all her ears. The Peruvian meditated for a few minutes, then slipped his hand into the pocket of his coat and brought out a discolored parchment, scrawled and scribbled with odd-looking letters in purple ink somewhat faded. "Did you ever see this before?" he asked Lucy, "or any manuscript like it?" "No," she answered, bending forward to examine the parchment carefully. Don Pedro again swept an inquiring eye round the circle, but everyone denied having seen the manuscript. "What is it?" asked Sir Frank curiously. Don Pedro restored the manuscript to his pocket. "It is an account of the embalming of Inca Caxus, written by his son who was my ancestor." "Then you are descended from this Inca?" said Mrs. Jasher eagerly. "I am. Had I my rights, I should rule Peru. As it is, I am a poor gentleman with very little money. That," added Don Pedro with emphasis, "is why I wish to recover the mummy of my great ancestor." "Is it then so valuable?" asked Archie suddenly. He was thinking of some reason why the mummy should have been stolen. "Well, in itself it is of no great value, save to an archaeologist," was Don Pedro's reply. "But I had better tell you the story of how it was stolen from my father." Go on," cried Mrs. Jasher. "This is most interesting." Don Pedro plunged into his story without further preamble. Inca Caxus held his state amidst the solitudes of the Andes, away from the cruel men who had conquered his country. He died and was buried. This manuscript, he touched his pocket, was written by his son and details the ceremonies, the place of sepulchre, and also gives a list of the jewels with which the mummy was buried. "Jewels," murmured Hope under his breath. "I thought as much." The son of Inca Caxus married a Spanish lady and made peace with the Spaniards. He came to live at Cusco and brought with him, for some purpose which the manuscript does not disclose, the mummy of his father. But the manuscript was lost for years, and although my family, the De Gallangosis, became poor, no member of it knew that, concealed in the corpse of Inca Caxus, were 2 large emeralds of immense value. The mummy of our royal ancestor was treated as a sacred thing and venerated accordingly. Afterwards, my family came to live at Lima, and I still dwell in the old house. "But how was the mummy stolen from you?" asked Random curiously. "I am coming to that," said Don Pedro, frowning at the interruption. "I was not in Lima at the time, but I had met the man who stole the precious mummy." "Was he a Spaniard?" "No," answered Don Pedro slowly. "He was an English sailor called Vasa." "Vasa is a Swedish name," observed Hope critically. "This man said that he was English, and certainly spoke like an Englishman, so far as I, a foreigner, can tell. At that time, when I was a young man, civil war raged in Peru. My father's house was sacked, and this Vasa, who had been received hospitably by my father when he was shipwrecked at Callao, stole the mummy of Inca Caxus." My father died of grief and charged me to get the mummy back. When peace was restored to my unhappy country, I tried to recover the venerated body of my ancestor, but all search proved vain, as Vasa had disappeared, and it was supposed that, for some reason, he had taken the embalmed body out of the country. It was when the mummy was lost that I unexpectedly came across the manuscript, which detailed the funeral ceremonies of Inca Caxus, and on learning about the 2 emeralds, I was naturally more anxious than ever to discover the mummy and retrieve my fallen fortunes by means of the jewels. But, as I said, all search proved vain, and I afterward married, thinking to settle down on what fortune remained to me. I did live quietly in Lima for years until my wife died. Then, with my daughter, I came to Europe on a visit. To search for the mummy? Questioned Archie eagerly. No, sir. I had given up all hope of finding that. But chance placed a clue in my hands. At Genoa, I came across a newspaper which stated that a mummy in a green case, and a Peruvian mummy at that, was for sale at Malta. I immediately made inquiries, thinking that this was the long-lost body of Inca Caxus. But it so happened that I was too late, as already the mummy had been sold to Professor Braddock and had been taken to England on board the Diver by Mr. Bolton. Chance, which had pointed out the whereabouts of the mummy, also brought me at Genoa into relations with Sir Frank Random. Don Pedro bowed his head to the baronet, and, as it appeared that he knew Professor Braddock, I thankfully accepted his offer to introduce me. Hence, I am here but only to hear that the mummy is again lost. That is all. And the Peruvian gentleman dramatically waved his arm. A strange story, said Archie, who was the first to speak, and it certainly solves at least one part of the mystery. What is that? Demanded Mrs. Jasher quickly. It shows that the mummy was stolen on account of the emeralds. Pardon me, but that is impossible, sir, said Don Pedro, drawing up his lean figure. No one but myself knew that the mummy held 2 emeralds in its dead hands, and I learned that only a few years ago from the manuscript which I had the honor of showing you. There is that objection, assuredly, replied Hope with composure. Yet I can hardly believe that any man would risk his neck to steal so remarkable a mummy, which he would have a difficulty in disposing of. But did this assassin know of the emeralds, he would venture much to gain them, since jewels can be disposed of with comparative ease and cannot easily be traced. All the same, said Random, looking up, I do not see how the assassin could have learned that the jewels were wrapped in the bandages. Humph, said Hope, glancing at De Gallegos. Perhaps there is more than one copy of this manuscript you speak of. Not to my knowledge. The sailor Vasa might have copied it. No, Don Pedro shook his head. It is written in Latin, since a Spanish priest taught the son of Inca Caxus, who wrote it, that language. I do not think that Vasa knew Latin. Also, if Vasa had copied the manuscript, he would have stripped the mummy to procure the jewels. Now, in the newspaper advertisement, it stated that the bandages of the mummy were intact, as also was the verdant case. No, said Don Pedro decisively. I am quite of opinion that Vasa, and indeed everyone else, was ignorant of this manuscript. It seems to me, suggested Mrs. Jasher, that it would be best to find this sailor. That, remarked De Gallegos, is impossible. It is 20 years since he disappeared with the mummy. Let us drop the subject until Professor Braddock returns to discuss it with me. And this was accordingly done. Chapter 12. A Discovery. 3 days went by, and Professor Braddock still remained absent in London, although an occasional letter to Lucy requested such and such an article from the museum to be forwarded, sometimes by post and on other occasions by Cockatoo, who traveled up to town especially. The Kanaka always returned with the news that his master was looking well, but brought no word of the professor's return. Lucy was not surprised, as she was accustomed to Braddock's vagaries. Meanwhile, Don Pedro, comfortably established at the Warrior Inn, wandered about Gartley in his dignified way, taking very little interest in the village, but a great deal in the pyramids. As the professor was absent, Lucy could not ask him to dinner, but she did invite him and Donna Inez to afternoon tea. Don Pedro was anxious to peep into the museum, but Cockatoo absolutely refused to let him enter, saying that his master had forbidden anyone to view the collection during his absence. And in this refusal, Cockatoo was supported by Miss Kendall, who had a wholesome dread of her stepfather's rage, should he return, and find that a stranger had been making free of his sacred apartments. The Peruvian gentleman expressed himself extremely disappointed, so much so, indeed, that Lucy fancied he believed Braddock had the green mummy hidden in the museum, in spite of the reported loss from the Sailor's Rest. Failing to get permission to range through the rooms of the pyramids, Don Pedro paid occasional visits to Pierside and questioned the police regarding the Bolton murder. From Inspector Date he learned nothing of any importance, and indeed that officer expressed his belief that not until the Day of Judgment would the truth become known. It then occurred to de Gallegos to explore the neighborhood of the Sailor's Rest and to examine that public house himself. He saw the famous window through which the mysterious woman had talked to the deceased, and noted that it looked across a stony, narrow path to the water's edge, wherefrom a rugged jetty ran out into the stream for some little distance. Nothing would have been easier, reflected Don Pedro, than for the assassin to enter by the window, and, having accomplished his deed, to leave in the same way, bearing the case containing the mummy. A few steps would carry the man and his burden to a waiting boat, and once the craft slipped into the mists on the river, all trace would be lost, as had truly happened. In this way, the Peruvian gentleman believed the murder and the theft had been accomplished, but even supposing things had happened as he surmised, still, he was as far as ever from unraveling the mystery. While Don Pedro searched for his royal ancestor's corpse, and incidentally, for the thief and murderer, his daughter was being wooed by Sir Frank Random. Heaven only knows what he saw in her, as Lucy observed to young Hope, for the girl had not a word to say for herself. She was undeniably handsome, and dressed with great taste, save for stray hints of barbaric delight in color, doubtless inherited from her Inca ancestors. All the same, she appeared to be devoid of small talk, or great talk, or any talk whatsoever. She sat and smiled and looked like a handsome picture, but after her appearance had satisfied the eye, she left much to be desired. Yet Sir Frank approved of her stately quietness, and seemed anxious to make her his wife. Lucy, in spite of the fact that he had so speedily got over her refusal to marry him, was anxious that he should be happy with Donna Inez, whom he appeared to love, and afforded him every opportunity of meeting the lady, so that he might prosecute his wooing. All the same, she wondered that he should desire to marry an iceberg, and Donna Inez, with her silent tongue and cold smiles, was little else. However, as Frank Random was the chief party concerned in the love-making, for Donna Inez was merely passive, there was no more to be said. Sometimes Hope came to dine at the pyramids, and on these occasions Mrs. Jasher was present in her character of chaperone. As Miss Kendall was helping the widow to marry Professor Braddock, she in her turn did her best to speed Archie's wooing. Certainly the young couple were engaged, and there was no understanding to be brought about. Nevertheless, Mrs. Jasher was a useful article of furniture to be in the room when they were together, for Gartley, like all English villages, was filled with scandalmongers who would have talked had Hope and Lucy not employed Mrs. Jasher as gooseberry. Sometimes Donna Inez came with the widow, while her father was hunting for the mummy in Pierside, and then Sir Frank Random would be sure to put in an appearance to woo his Dulcinea in admiring silence. Mrs. Jasher declared that the two must have made love by telepathy, for they rarely exchanged a word. But this was all the better, as Archie and Lucy chattered a great deal, and 2 pair of magpies, Mrs. Jasher declared, would have been too much for her nerves. She made a very good chaperone, as she allowed the young people to act as they pleased, only sanctioning the meetings by her elderly presence. One evening Mrs. Jasher was due to dinner, and Hope had already arrived. No one else was expected, as Don Pedro had taken his daughter to the theater at Pierside, and Sir Frank had gone to London in connection with his military duties. It was a bitterly cold night, and already a fall of snow had hinted that there was to be a real English Christmas of the genuine kind. Lucy had prepared an excellent dinner for 3, and Archie had brought a set of new patience cards for Mrs. Jasher, who was fond of the game. While the widow played, the lovers hoped to make love undisturbed, and looked forward to a happy evening. But there was one drawback, for although the dinner hour was supposed to be 8 o'clock and it was now 30 minutes past, Mrs. Jasher had not arrived. Lucy was dismayed. "What can be keeping her?" she asked Archie, to which that young gentleman replied that he did not know, and, what was more, he did not care. Miss Kendall very properly rebuked this sentiment. You ought to care, Archie, for you know that if Mrs. Jasher does not come to dinner, you will have to go away." "Why should I?" he inquired sulkily. "People will talk." "Let them. I don't care." "Neither do I, you stupid boy. But my father will care, and if people talk, he will be very angry." "My dear Lucy," and Archie put his arm round her waist to say this, "I don't see why you should be afraid of the professor. He is only your stepfather, and you aren't so very fond of him as to mind what he says. Besides, we can marry soon, and then he can go hang." "Not until Mrs. Jasher arrives," said Lucy primly. "Oh, bother." Hope, being quite exasperated with hunger, would have launched out into a speech condemning the widow's unpunctuality, when in the hall below the drawing-room was heard the sound of the door opening and closing. Without doubt, this was Mrs. Jasher arriving at last, and Lucy ran out of the room and down the stairs to welcome her, in her eagerness to get Archie seated at the dinner table. The young man lingered by the open door of the drawing-room, ready to welcome the widow, when he heard Lucy utter an exclamation of surprise and became aware that she was ascending the stairs along with Professor Braddock. At once he reflected there would be trouble, since he was in the house with Lucy, and lacked the necessary chaperone which Braddock's primitive Anglo-Saxon instincts insisted upon. "I did not know you were returning tonight," Lucy was saying when she re-entered the drawing-room with her stepfather. "I arrived by the 6 o'clock train," explained the professor, unwinding a large red scarf from his neck and struggling out of his overcoat with the assistance of his daughter. "Ha, Hope, good evening." "Where have you been since?" asked Lucy, throwing the professor's coat and wraps onto a chair. "With Mrs. Jasher," said Braddock, warming his plump hands at the fire. "So you must blame me that she is not here to preside at dinner as the chaperone of you young people." Lucy and her lover glanced at one another in surprise. This light and airy tone was a new one for the professor to take. Instead of being angry, he seemed to be unusually gay, and looked at them in quite a jocular manner for a dry-as-dust scientist. "We waited dinner for her, father," ventured Lucy timidly. "Then I am ready to eat it," announced Braddock. "I am extremely hungry, my dear. I can't live on love, you know." "Live on love?" Lucy stared, and Archie laughed quietly. "Oh, yes, you may smile and look astonished," went on the professor good-humoredly, "but science does not destroy the primeval instincts entirely. Lucy, my dear," he took her hand and patted it, "while in London and in lodgings, it was borne in upon me forcibly how lonely I was, and how lonely I would be when you married our young friend yonder. I had intended to come down tomorrow, but tonight such was my feeling of loneliness that I considered favorably your idea that I should find a second helpmate in Mrs. Jasher. I have always had a profound admiration for that lady, and so, on the spur of the moment, as I may say, I decided to come down this evening and propose." "Oh." Lucy clapped her hands, very well satisfied with the unexpected news. "And have you?" "Mrs. Jasher," said the professor gravely, "did me the honor to promise to become my wife this evening." "She will become your wife this evening?" said Archie, smiling. Braddock, with one of those odd twists of humor which were characteristic of him, became irascible. "Confound it, sir, don't I speak English?" he snapped with his eyes glaring rebuke. "She promised this evening to become Mrs. Braddock. We shall marry, so we have arranged, in the springtime, which is the natural pairing season for human beings as well as for birds. And I am glad to say that Mrs. Jasher takes a deep interest in archaeology. And, what is more, she is a splendid housekeeper," said Lucy. The temporary anger of the professor vanished. He drew his stepdaughter towards him and kissed her on the cheek. "I believe that I have to thank you for putting the idea into my head," said he, "and also, if Mrs. Jasher is to be believed, for aiding her to see the mutual advantage it would be to both of us to marry. Ha!" He released Lucy and rubbed his hands. "Let us go to dinner." "I am very glad," said Miss Kendall heartily. "So am I," replied Braddock, nodding. "As you very truly observed, my child, the house would have gone to rack and ruin without a woman to look after my interests." Well, he took the arms of the two young people. "I really think that we must have a bottle of champagne on the strength of it." Shortly, the trio were seated at the table, and Braddock explained that Mrs. Jasher, being overcome by his proposal, had not been able to face the ordeal of congratulations. "But she will come tomorrow," said he, as Cockatoo filled 3 glasses. "Indeed, I shall congratulate her tonight," said Lucy obstinately. "As soon as dinner is over, I shall go with Archie to her house and tell her how pleased I am." "It is very cold for you to be out, Lucy dear," urged Archie anxiously. "Oh, I can wrap up warmly," she answered. Strange to say, the professor made no objection to the excursion, although Hope quite expected such a stickler for etiquette to refuse permission to his stepdaughter. But Braddock seemed rather pleased than otherwise. His proposal of marriage seemed to have put him into excellent humor, and he raised his glass with a chuckle. "I drink to your happiness, my dear Lucy, and to that of Mrs. Jasher's." "And I drink to Archie's and to yours, father," she replied. "I am glad that you will not be lonely when we are married. Archie and I wish to become one in January." "Yes," said Hope, finishing his champagne. "My income is now all right, as my uncle has paid up." "Very good, very good." "I make no objection," said Braddock placidly. "I will give you a handsome wedding present, Lucy, for you may have heard that my future wife has money left to her by her brother, who was lately a merchant in Pekin. She is heart and hand with me in our proposed expedition to Egypt." "Will you go there for the honeymoon, sir?" asked Hope. "Not exactly for the honeymoon, since we are to be married in spring, and my expedition to the tomb of Queen Tahoser cannot start until the late autumn. But Mrs. Braddock will come with me. That is only just, since it will be her money which will furnish the sinews of war." "Well, everything is arranged very well," said Lucy. "I marry Archie. You, father, make Mrs. Jasher your wife, and I suspect Sir Frank will marry Donna Inez." "Ha!" said Braddock with a start. "The daughter of de Gallegos, who has come here for the missing mummy. Mrs. Jasher told me somewhat of that, my dear. But I shall see Don Pedro myself tomorrow. Meanwhile, let us eat and drink. I must go down to the museum, and you—" "We shall go to congratulate Mrs. Jasher," said Lucy. So it was arranged, and shortly Professor Braddock retired into his sanctum, along with the devoted Cockatoo, who displayed lively joy on beholding his master once more. Lucy, after being carefully wrapped up by Archie, set out with that young man to congratulate the bride-elect. It was just 9:30 when they started out. The night was frosty, and the stars twinkled like jewels in a cloudless sky of dark blue. The moon shone with hard brilliance on the ground, which was powdered with a light fall of snow. As the young people walked briskly through the village, their footsteps rang on the frosty earth, and they scrunched the snow in their quick tread. The Warrior Inn was still open, as it was not late, and lights shone from the windows of the various cottages. When the two, following the road through the marshes, emerged from the village, they saw the great mass of the fort bulking blackly against the clear sky, the glittering stream of the Thames, and the marshes outlined in delicate white. The fairy world of snow and moonlight appealed to Archie's artistic sense, and Lucy approving of the same, they did not hurry to arrive at their destination. But shortly they saw the squarely fenced acre of ground near the embankment, wherein Mrs. Jasher's humble abode was placed. Light shone through the pink curtains of the drawing-room, showing that the widow had not yet retired. In a few minutes the lovers were at the gate and promptly entered. It was then that one of those odd things happened, which would argue that some people are possessed of a sixth sense. Archie closed the gate after him and, glancing right and left, walked up the snowy path with Lucy. To the right was a leafless arbor, also powdered with snow, and against the white bulked a dark form, something like a coffin. Hope, out of curiosity, went up to it. "What the deuce is this?" he asked himself, then raised his voice in loud surprise. "Lucy, Lucy, come here." "What is it?" she asked, running up. "Look," he pointed to the oddly shaped case. "The green mummy." Chapter 13. More Mystery. "What are you talking about, my dear?" she said as Lucy led her towards the arbor. "I declare I was ever so much astonished when Jane told me that you wished to speak to me. I was just writing a letter to the lawyer who has my poor brother's property in hand, announcing my engagement to the professor." "Mr. Hope, you here also. Well, I'm sure." Lucy grew impatient at all this babble. "Did you not hear what I said, Mrs. Jasher?" she cried irritably. "Can't you use your eyes? Look, the green mummy is in your arbor." "The green mummy in my arbor," repeated Mrs. Jasher, like a child learning words of one syllable. and staring at the black object before which the three were standing. "As you see," said Archie abruptly. "How did it come here?" He spoke harshly. Of course, it was absurd to accuse Mrs. Jasher of knowing anything about the matter, since she had been writing letters. Still, the fact remained that a mummy, which had been thieved from a murdered man, was in her arbor, and naturally she was called upon to explain. Some suspicion in his tone struck the little woman, and she turned on him with indignation. "How did it come here?" she repeated. "Now, how can I tell you, silly boy? I have been writing to my lawyer about my engagement to Mr. Braddock. I dare say he has told you." "Yes," chimed in Miss Kendall, "and we came here to congratulate you, only to find the mummy." "Is that the horrid thing?" Mrs. Jasher stared with all her eyes and timidly touched the hard, green-stained wood. "It's the case. The mummy is inside." "But I thought that the professor opened the case to find the body of poor Sidney Bolton," argued Mrs. Jasher. "That was a packing case in which this," Archie struck the old-world coffin, "was stored. But this is the corpse of Inca Caxus, about which Don Pedro told us the other night. How does it come to be hidden in your garden?" "Hidden," Mrs. Jasher repeated the word with a laugh. "There is not much hiding about it. Why, everyone can see it from the path." "And from the door of your house," remarked Hope significantly. "Did you not see it when you took leave of Braddock?" "No," snapped the widow. "If I had, I should certainly have come to look. Also, Professor Braddock, who is so anxious to recover it, would not have allowed it to remain here." "Then the case was not here when the professor left you tonight?" "No, he left me at 8 o'clock to go home to dinner." "When did he arrive here?" questioned Hope quickly. "At 7. I am sure of the time, for I was just sitting down to my supper. He was here an hour. But he said nothing, when he entered, of any mummy being in the arbor. Nor when he left me at the door and I came to say goodbye to him, did either of us see this object. To be sure," added Mrs. Jasher meditatively, "we did not look particularly in the direction of this arbor. I scarcely see how anyone entering or leaving the garden could fail to see it, especially as the snow reflects the moonlight so brightly." Mrs. Jasher shivered, and taking the skirt of her tea-gown, flung it over her carefully attired head. "It is very cold," she remarked irritably. "Don't you think we had better return to the house and talk there?" "What?" said Archie grimly, "and leave the mummy to be carried away as mysteriously as it has been brought? No, Mrs. Jasher. That mummy represents 1,000 pounds of my money. I understood that the professor bought it himself." "So he did, but I supplied the purchase money. Therefore, I do not intend that this should be lost sight of again. Lucy, my dear, you run home again and tell your father what we have found. He had better bring men to take it to his museum. When it is there, Mrs. Jasher can then explain how it came to be in her garden." Without a word, Lucy set off, walking quickly, anxious to fulfill her mission and gladden the heart of her stepfather with the amazing news. Archie and Mrs. Jasher were left alone, and the former lighted a cigarette, while he tapped the mummy case and examined it as closely as the pale gleam of the moonlight permitted. Mrs. Jasher made no move to enter the house, much as she had complained of the cold. But perhaps she found the flimsy skirt of the tea-gown sufficient protection. "It seems to me, Mr. Hope," said she very tartly, "that you suspect my having a hand in this." And she tapped the mummy coffin also. "Pardon me," observed Hope very politely, "but I suspect nothing, because I have no grounds upon which to base my suspicions. But certainly, it is odd that this missing mummy should be found in your garden. You will admit that much." "I admit nothing of the sort," she rejoined coolly. "Only myself and Jane live in the cottage, and you don't expect that 2 delicate women could move this huge thing." She tapped the case again. "Moreover, had I found the mummy, I should have taken it to the pyramids at once, so as to give Professor Braddock some pleasure." "It will certainly be an acceptable wedding present," said Archie sarcastically. "Pardon me," said Mrs. Jasher in her turn, "but I have nothing to do with it as a present or otherwise. How the thing came into my arbor I really cannot say. As I told you, Professor Braddock made no remark about it when he came, and when he left, although I was at the door, I did not notice anything in this arbor. Indeed, I cannot say if I ever looked in this direction." Archie mused and glanced at his watch. "The professor told Lucy that he came by the 6 train. You say that he was here at 7. Yes, and he left at 8. What is the time now? 10 o'clock or a few minutes after. Therefore, since neither you nor Braddock saw the mummy, I take it that the case was brought here by some unknown people between 8 o'clock and 9:45, about which time I arrived here with Lucy." Mrs. Jasher nodded. "You put the matter very clearly," she observed dryly. "You have mistaken your vocation, Mr. Hope, and should have been a criminal lawyer. I should turn detective were I you." "Why?" asked Archie with a start. "You might ascertain my movements on the night when the crime was committed," snapped the little widow. "A woman muffled in a shawl in much the same way as my head is now muffled in my skirt talked to Bolton through the bedroom window of the Sailor's Rest, you know." Hope expostulated. "My dear lady, how you run on! I assure you that I would as soon suspect Lucy as you." "Thank you," said the widow very dryly and very tartly. "I merely wish to point out," went on Archie in a conciliatory tone, "that, as the mummy in its case, as appears probable, was brought into your garden between the hours of 8 and 10 less 15 minutes, that you may have heard the voices or footsteps of those who carried it here." "I heard nothing," said Mrs. Jasher, turning towards the path. "I had my supper and played a game or two of patience, and then wrote letters, as I told you before. And I am not going to stand in the cold, answering silly questions, Mr. Hope. If you wish to talk, you must come inside." Hope shook his head and lighted a fresh cigarette. "I stand guard over this mummy until its rightful owner comes," said he determinedly. "Ho!" rejoined Mrs. Jasher scornfully. She was now at the door. "I understood that you bought the mummy, and therefore were its owner. Well, I only hope you'll find those emeralds Don Pedro talked about." And with a light laugh, she entered the cottage. Archie looked after her in a puzzled way. There was no reason to suspect Mrs. Jasher, so far as he saw, even though a woman had been seen talking to Bolton on the night of the crime. And yet, why should the widow refer to the emeralds, which were of such immense value, according to Don Pedro? Hope glanced at the case and shook the primitive coffin, anxious for the moment to open it and ascertain if the jewels were still clutched grimly in the mummy's dead hands. But the coffin was fastened tightly down with wooden pegs and could only be opened with extreme care and difficulty. Also, as Hope reflected, even did he manage to open this receptacle of the dead, he still could not ascertain if the emeralds were safe, since they would be hidden under innumerable swathings of green-dyed llama wool. He therefore let the matter rest there, and, staring at the river, wondered how the mummy had been brought to the garden in the marshes. Hope recollected that experts had decided the mode in which the mummy had been removed from the Pierside public house. It had been passed through the window, according to Inspector Date and others, and when taken across the narrow path which bordered the river, had been placed in a waiting boat. After that it had vanished until it had reappeared in this arbor. But if taken by water once, it could have been taken by water again. There was a rude jetty behind the embankment, which Hope could easily see from where he stood. In all probability, the mummy had been landed there and carried to the garden, while Mrs. Jasher was busy with her supper and her game of cards and her letters. Also, the path from the shore to the house was very lonely, and if any care had been exercised, which was probable, no one from the fort road or from the village street could have seen the stealthy conspirators bringing their weird burden. So far, Hope felt that he could argue excellently. But who had brought the mummy to the garden, and why had it been brought there? These questions he could not answer so easily, and indeed not at all. While thus meditating, he heard, far away in the frosty air, a puffing and blowing and panting like an impatient motor car. Before he could guess what this was, Braddock appeared, simply racing along the marshy causeway, followed closely by Cockatoo, and at some distance away by Lucy. The little scientist rushed through the gate, which he flung open with a noise fit to wake the dead, and lunged forward to fall with outstretched arms upon the green case. There he remained, still puffing and blowing, and looked as though he were hugging a huge green beetle. Cockatoo, who, being lean and hard, kept his breath more easily, stood respectfully by, waiting for his master to give orders, and Lucy came in quietly by the gate, smiling at her father's enthusiasm. At the same moment, Mrs. Jasher, well wrapped up in a coat of sables, emerged from the cottage. "I heard you coming, Professor," she called out, hurrying down the path. "I should think the whole fort heard the Professor coming," said Hope, glancing at the dark mass. "The soldiers must think it is an invasion." But Braddock paid no heed to this jocularity, or even to Mrs. Jasher, to whom he had been so lately engaged. All his soul was in the mummy case, and as soon as he recovered his breath, he loudly proclaimed his joy at this miraculous recovery of the precious article. "Mine! Mine!" he roared, and his words ran violently through the frosty air. "Be calm, sir," advised Hope. "Be calm." "Calm! Calm!" bellowed Braddock, struggling to a standing position. "Oh, confound you, sir, how can I be calm when I find what I have lost? You have a mean, groveling soul, Hope, not the soaring spirit of a collector." "There is no need to be rude to Archie, father," corrected Lucy sharply. "Rude, rude! I am never rude. But this mummy—" Braddock peered closely at it and rapped the wood to assure himself it was no phantom. "Yes, it is my mummy, the mummy of Inca Caxus. Now I shall learn how the Peruvians embalmed their royal dead. Mine, mine, mine!" He crooned like a mother over a child, caressing the coffin, then suddenly drew himself upright and fixed Mrs. Jasher with an indignant eye. "So it was you, madam, who stole my mummy," he declared venomously, "and I thought of making you my wife. Oh, what an escape I have had! Shame, woman, shame!" Mrs. Jasher stared. Then her face grew redder than the rouge on her cheeks, and she stamped furiously in the neat Louis Quinze slippers in which she had injudiciously come out. "How dare you say what you have said?" she cried, her voice shrill and hard with anger. "Mr. Hope has been saying the same thing. Are you both mad? I never set eyes on the horrid thing in my life, and only tonight you told me that you loved—" "Yes, yes, I said many foolish things, I don't doubt, madam, but that is not the question. My mummy!" "My mummy," he rapped the wood furiously. "How does my mummy come to be here?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Jasher, still furious, "and I don't care." Don't care, when I look forward to your helping me in my life work." "As my wife?" "I shall never be your wife," cried the widow, stamping again. "I wouldn't be your wife for 1,000 or 1,000,000 pounds. Marry your mummy, you horrid, red-faced, crabbed little—" "Hush, hush," whispered Lucy, taking the angry woman round the waist. "You must make allowances for my father. He is so excited over his good fortune that he—" "I shall not make allowance," interrupted Mrs. Jasher angrily. "He practically accuses me of stealing the mummy. If I did that, I must have murdered poor Sidney Bolton." "No, no," cried the professor, wiping his red face. "I never hinted at such a thing, but the mummy is in your garden." "What of that? I don't know how it came there. Mr. Hope, surely you do not support Professor Braddock in his preposterous accusation." "I bring no accusation," stuttered the professor. "Neither do I, Mrs. Jasher. You are excited now. Go in and sleep, and tomorrow you will talk reasonably." This brilliant speech was from Hope, and wrought Mrs. Jasher into a royal rage. "Well," she gasped, "he asks me to be calm, as it I wasn't the very calmest person here. I declare, oh, I shall be ill. Lucy," she seized the girl's hand and dragged her towards the cottage, "come in and give me red lavender. I shall be in bed for days and days and days." Oh, what brutes men can be. "But listen, you two horrors," she indicated Braddock and Hope, as she pushed open the door. "If you dare to say a word against me, I'll have an action for libel against you. Oh, dear me, how very ill I feel. Lucy, darling, help me, and oh. She flopped down on the threshold of her home with a cry. "Archie, Archie, she's fainted!" Hope rushed forward and raised the stout little woman in his arms. Jane, attracted by the clamor, appeared on the scene, and between the three of them, they managed to get Mrs. Jasher placed on the sofa of the pink drawing room. She certainly was in a dead faint, so Hope left her to the administrations of Lucy and the servant, and walked out again into the garden, closing the cottage door after him. He found the heartless professor quite oblivious to Mrs. Jasher's sufferings, so taken up was he with the newly found mummy. Cockatoo had been sent for a hand-cart, and while he was absent, Braddock expatiated on the perfections of this relic of Peruvian civilization. "Will you sell it to Don Pedro?" asked Hope. "After I have done with it, not before," snapped Braddock, hovering round his treasure. "I shall want a percentage on my bargain also." Archie thought privately that if Braddock unswathed the mummy, he would find the emeralds and would probably stick to them so that his expedition to Egypt might be financed. In that case, Don Pedro would no longer wish to buy the corpse of his ancestor. But while he debated as to the advisability of telling the professor of the existence of the emeralds, Cockatoo returned with the handcart. "You have lost Mrs. Jasher," said Hope, while he assisted the professor to hoist the mummy onto the cart. "Never mind, never mind." Braddock patted the coffin. "I have found something much more to my mind, something ever so much better. Ha ha." Chapter 14. The unexpected happens. In spite of newspapers and letters and tape machines and telegrams and such like aids to the speedy diffusion of news, the same travels quicker in villages than in cities. Word of mouth can spread gossip with marvelous rapidity in sparsely inhabited communities, since it is obvious that in such places every person knows the other, as the saying goes, inside out. In every English village, walls have ears and windows have eyes, so that every cottage is a hotbed of scandal, and what is known to one is, within the hour, known to the others. Even the Sphinx could not have preserved her secret long in such a locality. Gartley could keep up its reputation in this respect along with the best. Therefore, it was little to be wondered at that early next morning everyone knew that Professor Braddock had found his long-lost mummy in Mrs. Jasher's garden and had removed the same to the pyramids without unnecessary delay. It was not particularly late when the handcart, with its uncanny burden, had passed along the sole street of the place, and several men had emerged from the Warrior Inn ostensibly to offer help, but really to know what the eccentric master of the great house was doing. Braddock brusquely rejected these offers, but the oddly shaped mummy case, stained green having been seen, it needed little wit for those who had caught a sight of it to put two and two together, especially as the weird object had been described at the inquest and had been talked over ever since in every cottage. And as the cart had been seen coming out of the widow's garden, it naturally occurred to the villagers that Mrs. Jasher had been concealing the mummy. Shortly the rumor spread that she had also murdered Bolton, for unless she had done so, she certainly, according to village logic, could not have been possessed of the spoil. Finally, as Mrs. Jasher's doors and windows were small and the mummy was rather bulky, it was natural to presume that she had hidden it in the garden. Report said she had buried it and had dug it up just in time to be pounced upon by its rightful owner, from which it can be seen that gossip is not invariably accurate. However this may be, the news of Professor Braddock's good fortune shortly came to Don Pedro's ears through the medium of the landlady. As she revealed what she had heard in the morning, the Peruvian gentleman was spared a sleepless night. But as soon as he learned the truth, which was surprising enough in its unexpectedness, he hastily finished his breakfast and hurried to the pyramids. As yet, he had not intended to see Braddock so promptly, or at least not until he had made further inquiries at Pierside. But the news that Braddock possessed the royal ancestor of the de Gallengoses brought him immediately into the museum. He greeted the professor in his usual grave and dignified manner, and no one would have guessed from his inherent calmness that the unexpected news of Braddock's arrival and the still more unexpected information about the green mummy had surprised him beyond measure. Being somewhat superstitious, it also occurred to Don Pedro that the coincidence meant good fortune to him in the recovery of his long-lost ancestor. Braddock, already knowing a great deal about Don Pedro from Lucy and Archie Hope, was only too pleased to see the Peruvian, hoping to find in him a kindred spirit. As yet, the professor was not aware of the contents of the ancient Latin manuscript, which revealed the fact of the hidden emeralds, since Hope had decided to leave it to the Peruvian to impart the information. Archie knew very well that Don Pedro, as he had plainly stated, wished to purchase the mummy, and it was only right that Braddock should know what he was selling. But Hope forgot one important fact, perhaps from the careless way in which Don Pedro had told his story, namely, that the professor, in a second degree, was a receiver of stolen goods. Therefore, it was more than probable that the Peruvian would claim the mummy as his own property. Still, in that event, he would have to prove his claim, and that would not be easy. The plump little professor had not yet unsealed the case, and when Don Pedro entered, he was standing before it rubbing his fat hands, with a gloating expression in his face. However, as Cockatoo had brought in the Peruvian's card, Braddock expected his visitor and wheeled to face him. "How are you, sir?" said he, extending his hand. "I am glad to see you, as I hear that you know all about this mummy of Inca Caxus." "Well, I do," answered de Gallegos, sitting down in the chair which his host pushed forward. "But may I ask who told you that this mummy was that of the last Inca?" Braddock pinched his plump chin and replied readily, "Enough. Certainly, Don Pedro. I wished to learn the difference in embalming between the Egyptians and the ancient Peruvians, and looked about for a South American corpse. Unexpectedly, I saw in several European newspapers and in 2 English journals that a green Peruvian mummy was for sale at Malta for £1,000. I sent my assistant, Sidney Bolton, to buy it, and he managed to get it, coffin and all, for £900. While in Malta, and before he started back in the diver with the mummy, he wrote me an account of the transaction. The seller, who was the son of a Maltese collector, told Bolton that his father had picked up the mummy in Paris some 20 and more years ago. It came from Lima some 30 years back, I believe, and, according to the collector in Paris, was the corpse of Inca Caxus. That is the whole story." Don Pedro nodded gravely. "Was there a Latin manuscript delivered along with the mummy?" he asked. Braddock's eyes opened widely. "No, sir. The mummy came 30 years ago from Lima to Paris. It passed 20 years back into the possession of the Maltese collector, and his son sold it to me a few months ago. I never heard of any manuscript." "Then Mr. Hope did not repeat to you what I told him the other night?" The professor sat down and his mouth grew obstinate. "Mr. Hope related some story you told him, and others about this mummy having been stolen from you." "From my father," corrected the unsmiling Peruvian, keeping a careful eye on his host. "That is really the case. Inca Caxus is, or was, my ancestor, and this manuscript," Don Pedro produced the same from his inner pocket, "details the funeral ceremonies." "Very interesting, most interesting," fussed Braddock, stretching out his hand. "May I see it?" "You read Latin," observed Don Pedro, surrendering the manuscript. Braddock raised his eyebrows. "Of course," he said simply. "Every well-educated man reads Latin, or should do so. Wait, sir, until I glance through this document." "One moment," said Don Pedro, as the professor began to literally devour the discolored page. "You know from Hope, I have no doubt, how I chance upon my own property in Europe." Braddock, still with his eyes on the manuscript, mumbled, "Your own property. Quite so, quite so. You admit that. Then you will no doubt restore the mummy to me." By this time, the drift of Don Pedro's observations entirely reached the understanding of the scientist, and he dropped the document he was reading to leap to his feet. "Restore the mummy to you," he gasped. "Why, it is mine." "Pardon me," said the Peruvian, still gravely but very decisively. "You admitted that it belonged to me." Braddock's face deepened to a fine purple. "I didn't know what I was saying," he protested. "How could I say it was your property when I had bought it for £900? It was stolen from me." "That has got to be proved," said Braddock caustically. Don Pedro rose, looking more like Don Quixote than ever. "I have the honor to give you my word, and—" Yes, that is all right. I cast no imputation on your honor." "I should think not," said the other coldly but strongly. "All the same, you can scarcely expect me to part with so valuable an object." Braddock waved his hand towards the case, "without strict inquiry into the circumstances. And again, sir, even if you succeed in proving your ownership, I am not inclined to restore the mummy to you for nothing. But it is stolen property you are keeping from me." "I know nothing about that. I have only your bare word that it is so, Don Pedro. All I know is that I paid £900 for the mummy, and that it cost the best part of another 100 to bring it to England. What I have, I keep." "Like your country," said the Peruvian sarcastically. "Precisely," replied the professor suavely. "Every Englishman has a bulldog tenacity of purpose. Bragg is a good dog, Don Pedro, but Holdfast is a better one." "Then I understand," said the Peruvian, stretching out his hand to pick up the fallen manuscript, "that you will keep the mummy." "Certainly," said Braddock coolly, "since I have paid for it. Also, I shall keep the jewels, which the manuscript tells me, from the glance I obtained of it, were buried with it." "The sole jewels buried are 2 large emeralds which the mummy holds in its hands," explained Don Pedro, restoring the manuscript to his pocket, "and I wish for them so that I may get money to restore the fortunes of my family." "No, no, no," said Braddock forcibly. "I have bought the mummy and the jewels with it. They will sell to supply me with money to fit out my expedition to the tomb of Queen Tahoser." "I shall dispute your claim," cried de Gallegos, losing his calmness. Braddock waved his hand with supreme contempt. "I can give you the address of my lawyers," he retorted. "Any steps you choose to take will only result in loss, and from what you hint, I should not think that you had much money to spend on litigation." Don Pedro bit his lip and saw that it was indeed a more difficult task than he had anticipated to make Braddock yield up his prize. "If you were in Lima," he muttered, speaking Spanish in his excitement, "you would then learn that I speak truly." "I do not doubt your truth," answered the professor in the same language. De Gallegos wheeled and faced his host, much surprised. "You speak my tongue, senor?" he demanded. Braddock nodded. "I have been in Spain, and I have been in Peru," he answered dryly. "Therefore, I know classical Spanish and its colonial dialects. As to being in Lima, I was there, and I do not wish to go there again, as I had quite enough of those uncivilized parts 30 years ago, when the country was much disturbed after your civil war." "You were in Lima 30 years ago," echoed Don Pedro. "Then you were there when Vasa stole this mummy." "I don't know who stole it, or even if it was stolen," said the professor obstinately. "And I don't know the name of Vasa. Ah, now I remember. Young Hope did say something about the Swedish sailor who you said stole the mummy." "Vasa did, and brought it to Europe to sell. Probably to that man in Paris, who afterwards sold it to your Maltese's collector." "No doubt," rejoined Braddock calmly. "But what has all this to do with me, Don Pedro?" "I want my mummy," raged the other, and looked dangerous. "Then you won't get it," retorted Braddock, adopting a pugnacious attitude and quite composed. "This mummy has caused one death, Don Pedro, and from your looks I should think you would like it to cause another. Will you not be honest?" "I'll knock your head off if you bring my honesty into question," cried the professor, standing on tiptoe like a bantam. "The best thing to do will be to take the matter into court. Then the law can decide, and I have little doubt but what it will decide in my favor." The Englishman and the Peruvian glared at one another, and Cockatoo, who was crouching on the floor, glanced from one angry face to another. He guessed that the white men were quarreling, and perhaps would come to blows. It was at this moment that a knock came to the door, and a minute later Archie entered. Braddock glanced at him and took a sudden resolution as he stepped forward. "Hope, you're just in time," he declared. "Don Pedro states that the mummy belongs to him, and I assert that I have bought it. We shall make you umpire. He wants it. I want it. What is to be done?" "The mummy is my own flesh and blood, Mr. Hope," said Don Pedro. "Precious little of either about it," said Braddock contemptuously. Archie twisted a chair round and straddled his long legs across it, with his arms resting on its back. His quick brain had rapidly comprehended the situation, and being acquainted with both sides of the question, it was not difficult to come to a decision. If it was hard that Don Pedro should lose his ancestor's mummy, it was equally hard that Braddock, or rather himself, should lose the purchase money, seeing that it had been paid in good faith to the seller in Malta for a presumably righteously acquired object. On these premises, the young Solon proceeded to deliver judgment. "I understand," said he judiciously, "that Don Pedro had the mummy stolen from him 30 years ago, and that you, Professor, bought it under the impression that the Maltese owner had a right to possess it." "Yes," snapped Braddock, "and I dare say the Maltese owner thought so too, since he bought it from that collector in Paris." Hope nodded. "And if Vasa sold it to the man in Paris," said he calmly, "he certainly would not tell the purchaser that he had looted the mummy in Lima, and the poor man would not know that he was receiving stolen goods. Is that right, Don Pedro?" "Yes, sir," said the Peruvian, who had recovered his temper and his gravity. "But I declare solemnly that the mummy was stolen from my father and should belong to me." "No one disputes that," said Archie cheerfully, "but it ought to belong to the professor also, since he has bought it. Now, as it can't possibly belong to two people, we must split the difference. You, Professor, must sell back the mummy to Don Pedro for the price you paid for it. And then, Don Pedro, you must recompense Professor Braddock for his loss." "I have not much money," said Don Pedro gravely. "Still, I am willing to do as you say." "I don't know that I am," protested Braddock noisily. "There are the 2 emeralds, which are of immense value, as Don Pedro says, and they belong to me, since the mummy is my property." "Professor," said Archie solemnly, "you must do right, even if you lose by it. I believe the story of Señor de Gallegos, and the mummy with its jewels belongs to him. Besides, you only wish to see the way in which the Inca race embalmed their dead. Well then, unpack the mummy here in the presence of Don Pedro. When you have satisfied your curiosity, and when Señor de Gallegos signs a check for 1,000 pounds, he can take away the corpse. You have had so much trouble over it that I wonder you are not anxious to see the last of it. But the emeralds would sell for much money and would defray the expenses of my expedition into Egypt to search for that queen's tomb. I understood from Lucy that Mrs. Jasher intended to finance that expedition when she became your wife." "Humph," muttered Braddock, stroking his fat chin. "I said a few foolish things to her last night when I was heated up. She may not forgive me, Hope." "A woman will forgive anything to the man she loves," said Archie. Braddock was no fool, and could not help casting a glance at his tubby figure, which was reflected in a near mirror. It seemed incredible that Mrs. Jasher could love him for his looks, and the fact that he might someday be a baronet did not strike him at the moment as a consideration. However, he foresaw trouble and expense should Don Pedro go to law, as he seemed determined to do. Taking all things into consideration, Braddock thought that Archie's judgment was a good one, and yielded. "Well," he said after reflection, "let us agree. I shall open the case and examine the mummy, which after all is the reason why I bought it. When I have satisfied myself as to the difference between the modes of embalming, Don Pedro can give me a check and take away the mummy. I only hope that he will have less trouble with it than I have had." And, so speaking, Braddock, signing to Cockatoo to bring all the necessary tools, laid hands on the case. "I am content," said Don Pedro briefly, and seated himself in a chair beside the young Daniel who had delivered judgment. Hope offered to assist the professor to open the case, but was dismissed with an abrupt refusal. "Though I am glad you are present to see the mummy unpacked," said Braddock, laboring at the lid of the case, "for if the emeralds are missing, Don Pedro might accuse me of stealing them." "Why should the emeralds be missing?" asked Hope quickly. Braddock shrugged his shoulders. "Sidney Bolton was killed," said he in a low voice, "and it was not likely that anyone would commit a murder for the sake of this mummy, and then leave it stranded in Mrs. Jasher's garden. I have my doubts about the safety of the emeralds, else I would not have consented to sell the thing back again." With this honest speech, the professor vigorously attacked the lid of the case and inserted a steel instrument into the cracks to prise up the covering. The lid was closed with wooden pegs in an antique but perfectly safe manner, and apparently had not been opened since the dead Inca had been laid to rest therein hundreds of years ago among the Andean mountains. Don Pedro winced at this desecration of the dead, but as he had given his consent, there was nothing left to do but to grin and bear it. In a wonderfully short space of time, considering the neatness of the workmanship and the holding power of the wooden pegs, the lid was removed. Then the 4 onlookers saw that the mummy had been tampered with. Swathed in green-stained llama wool, it lay rigid in its case, but the swathings had been cut, the hands protruded, and the emeralds were gone, torn rudely from the hard grip of the dead. Chapter 15. An Accusation. Both Don Pedro and Professor Braddock were amazed and angry at the disappearance of the jewels, but Hope did not express much surprise. Considering the facts of the murder, it was just what he expected, although it must be confessed that he was wise after the event. "I refer you to your own words immediately before the case was opened, Professor," he remarked after the first surprise had subsided. "Words! Words!" snapped Braddock, who was anything but pleased. "What words of mine do you mean, Hope?" "You said that it was not likely that anyone would commit a murder for the sake of the mummy only, and then leave it stranded in Mrs. Jasher's garden. Also, you declared that you had your doubts about the safety of the emeralds, else you would not have consented to sell the mummy again to its rightful owner." The professor nodded. "Quite so, quite so. And what I say I hold to," he retorted, "especially as I have proved myself a true prophet. You can both see for yourselves. Quote, he waved his hand towards the rifled case. That poor Sidney must have been killed for the sake of the emeralds. The question is, who killed him? The person who knew about the jewels, said Don Pedro promptly. Of course, but who did know? I was ignorant until you told me about the manuscript. And you, Hope? He searched Archie's face. Do you intend to accuse me? Questioned the young man with a slight laugh. I assure you, Professor, that I was ignorant of what had been buried with the corpse until Don Pedro related his story the other night to myself in random and the ladies. Braddock turned impatiently to De Gallegos, as he did not approve of Archie's apparent flippancy. Does anyone else know of the contents of this manuscript? He demanded irritably. Don Pedro nursed his chin and looked musingly on the ground. It is just possible that Vasa may. Vasa? Vasa? Oh yes, the sailor who stole the mummy 30 years ago from your father in Lima. Pooh, pooh, pooh. You tell me that this manuscript is written in Latin, and evidently in monkish Latin at that, which is of the worst. Your sailor could not read it, and would not know the value of the manuscript. If he had, he would have carried it off. Senor, said the Peruvian politely, I have an idea that my father made a translation of this manuscript, or at all events a copy. But I understood, put in Hope, still astride of his chair, that you did not find the original manuscript until your father died. That is quite true, sir, assented the other readily. But I did not tell you everything the other night. My father it was who found the manuscript at Cusco, and although I cannot state authoritatively, yet I believe I am correct in saying that he had a copy made. But whether the copy was merely a transcript or actually a translation, I cannot tell. I think it was the former, as if Vasa, reading a translation, had learned of the jewels. He undoubtedly would have stolen them before selling this mummy to the Parisian collector. Perhaps he did, said Braddock, pointing to the rifled corpse. You see that the emeralds are missing. Your assistant's assassin stole them, insisted Don Pedro coldly. We cannot be sure of that, retorted the professor, although I admit that no man would jeopardize his neck for the sake of a corpse. Archie looked surprised. But an enthusiast such as you are, Professor, might risk so much. For once in his life, Braddock made a good-humored reply. No, sir. Not even for this mummy would I place myself in the power of the law, and I do not think that any other scientist would either. We savants may not be worldly, but we are not fools. However, the fact remains that the jewels are gone, and whether they were stolen by Vasa 30 years ago or by poor Sidney's assassin the other day, I don't know. And, what is more, I don't care. I shall examine the mummy further, and in a couple of days, Don Pedro can bring me a check for 1,000 and remove his ancestor. No, no, cried the Peruvian hurriedly. Since the emeralds are missing, I am not in a position to pay you 1,000 English pounds, sir. I want to take back the body of Inca Caxus to Lima, as one must show respect to one's ancestors. But the fact is, I cannot pay the money. You said that you could, shouted the exasperated professor in his bullying way. I admit it, senor, but I had hoped to do so when I sold the emeralds, which, as you can see, are not available. Therefore, the body of my royal ancestor must remain here until I can procure the money, and it may be that Sir Frank Random will help me in this matter. He wouldn't help me, snapped Braddock. So why should he help you? Don Pedro, looking more dignified than ever, drew himself up to his tall height. Sir Frank, he said in a stately way, has done me the honor of seeking to be my son-in-law. As my daughter loves him, I am willing to permit the marriage. But now that I have learned the emeralds are lost, I shall not consent until Sir Frank buys the mummy from you, Professor. It is only right that my daughter's hand should redeem her regal forefather from purely scientific surroundings, and that she should take the mummy back to be buried in Lima. At the same time, sir, I must say that I am the rightful owner of the dead, and that you should surrender the mummy to me free of charge. What? And lose 1,000 pounds? Cried Braddock furiously. No, sir. I shall do nothing of the sort. You only wanted the mummy for the sake of the jewels, and now that they are lost, you do not care what becomes of your confounded ancestor, and you. The professor would have gone on still more furiously, but that Hope, seeing Don Pedro was growing angry at the insult, chimed in. "Let me throw oil on the troubled waters," he said smoothly. "Don Pedro is not able to redeem the mummy until the emeralds are found. As such is the case, we must find the emeralds and enable him to do what is necessary." "And how are we to find the jewels?" asked Braddock crossly. "By finding the assassin." "How is that to be done?" asked de Gallegos gloomily. "I have been doing my best at Pierside, but I cannot find a single clue. Vasa is not to be found." "Vasa!" exclaimed Archie and the professor, both profoundly astonished. Don Pedro raised his eyebrows. "Certainly. Vasa, if anyone, must have killed your assistant, since he alone could have known that the jewels were buried with Inca Caxus." "But, my dear sir," argued Hope good-naturedly, "if Vasa stole the manuscript, whether translated or not, he certainly must have learned the truth long, long ago, since 30 years have elapsed. In that event, he must have stolen the jewels, as Professor Braddock remarked lately, before he sold the mummy to the Parisian collector." "That may be so," said Don Pedro obstinately, while the professor muttered his approval, "but we cannot be certain on that point. No one, I agree with the professor in this, would have risked his neck to steal a mere mummy. Therefore, the motive for the committal of the crime must have been the emeralds. Only Vasa knew of their existence outside myself and my dead father. He, therefore, must be the assassin. I shall hunt for him, and when I find him, I shall have him arrested." "But you can't possibly recognize the man after 30 years?" argued Braddock disbelievingly. "I have a royal memory for faces," said Don Pedro imperturbably, "and in the past I saw much of Vasa. He was then a young sailor of 20. "Humph," muttered Braddock. "He is now 50 and must have changed in 30 years. You'll never recognize him." "Oh, I think so," said the Peruvian smoothly. His eyes were peculiarly blue and full of light. "Also, he had a scar on the right temple from a blow which he received in a street riot, in which I also was concerned. Finally, gentlemen, Vasa loved a peon girl on my father's estate, and she induced him to have the sun encircled by a serpent, a Peruvian symbol tattooed on his left wrist. With all these marks, and with my memory for faces, which never yet has failed me, I have no doubt but what I shall recognize the man. And then I shall have him arrested." Hope shrugged his square shoulders. He had not much belief in Don Pedro's boasted royal memory, and did not think that he would recognize a young sailor of 20 in what would certainly be a grizzled old salt of 50 years. However, it was possible that the man might be right in his surmise, since Vasa alone could have known about the emeralds. The only doubt was whether he would have waited for 30 years before looting the mummy. Archie said nothing of these thoughts, as they would only serve to prolong an unprofitable discussion. But he made one suggestion. "Your best plan," he said suggestively, "is to write a description of Vasa, who, by the way, has probably changed his name, and hand it to the police with the promise of a reward if he is found." "I am very poor, senor. Surely the professor here—" "I can offer nothing," said Braddock quickly, "as I am quite as poor as you are. If not more so, Sir Frank might help," he added sarcastically. "I shall not ask," said Don Pedro loftily. "If Sir Frank chooses to become my son-in-law by purchasing back my royal ancestor, to which you have no right, I am willing that it should be so. But, poor as I am, I shall offer a reward myself, since the honor of the de Gallegoses is involved in this matter. What reward do you suggest, Mr. Hope?" £500, said the professor quickly. "Too much," said Hope sharply. "Far too much." "Make the reward £100, Don Pedro. That is enough to tempt many a man." The Peruvian bowed and noted down the amount. "I shall go at once to Pierside and see Inspector Date, who had to do with the inquest," he remarked. "Meanwhile, Professor, please do not desecrate my royal ancestor's body more than you can help." "I shall certainly not search for any more emeralds," retorted Braddock dryly. "Now clear out, both of you, and leave me to examine the mummy. Cockatoo, show these gentlemen out, and let no one else in." "Guess your property should behave itself then," said the captain in careless tones, and sauntered into the room. "D'ye think I'm going to be chucked out by a measly nigger and—" "Great Scott!" This latter exclamation was extorted by the sight of the mummy. Braddock motioned to the still angry Cockatoo to move aside, and then nodded triumphantly. "You didn't expect to see that, did you?" he asked. Hervey came to anchor on a chair and turned the cheroot in his mouth with an odd look at the mummy. "When will he be hanged?" Braddock stared. "When will who be hanged?" The man as stole that thing. We haven't found him yet, Braddock informed him swiftly. Then how in creation did you annex the corpse? The professor sat down and explained. The lean, long mariner listened quietly, only nodding at intervals. He did not seem to be surprised when he heard that the corpse of the head Inca had been found in Mrs. Jasher's garden, especially when Braddock explained the whereabouts of the property. "Wow," he drawled. "That don't make my hair stand on end. I guess the garden was on his way and he used it for a cemetery." "What are you talking about?" demanded the perplexed scientist. "About the man who strangled your help and yanked away the corpse?" "But I don't know who he is. Nobody knows." "Go slow, I do." "You!" Braddock started and flung himself across the room to seize Hervey by the lapels of his reefer coat. "You know. Tell me who he is so that I can get the emeralds." "Emeralds?" Hervey removed Braddock's plump hands and stared greedily. "Don't you know?" "No, of course you don't. But 2 emeralds were buried with the mummy, and they have been stolen." "Who by?" "No doubt by the assassin who murdered poor Sidney." Hervey spat on the floor, and his weather-beaten face took on an expression of profound regret. "I guess I'm a fool of the best." "Why?" asked Braddock, again puzzled. "To think," said Hervey, addressing the mummy, "that you were on board my boat, and I never looted you." "What?" Braddock stamped. "Would you have committed theft?" "Theft be hanged," was the reply. "It ain't thieving to loot the dead. I guess a corpse hasn't got any use for jewels. You bet I'd have gummed straightways onto that mummy when I brought it from Malta in the old diver, had I known it was a jeweler's shop of sorts." "Huh, 2 emeralds, and I never knew. I could kick myself." "You are a blackguard," gasped the astonished professor. "Oh, shucks," was the elegant retort. "Give it a rest. I'm no worse than that dandy gentleman who added murder to stealing anyhow." "Ah!" Braddock bounded off his chair like an India rubber ball. "You said that you knew who had committed the murder." "Well," drawled Hervey again, "I do, and I don't. That is, I suspect, but I can't swear to the business before a judge." "Who killed Bolton?" asked the professor furiously. "Tell me at once." "Not me, unless it's made worth my while." "It will be by Don Pedro." "That yellow stomach, what's he got to do with it?" "I have just told you the mummy belongs to him. He came to Europe to find it. He wants the emeralds and intends to offer a reward of £100 for the discovery of the assassin." Hervey arose briskly. "I'm right on the job," said he, sauntering to the door. "I'll go to that old inn of yours, where you say the Don's stopping, and look him up. Guess I'll trade." "But who killed Bolton?" asked Braddock, running to the door and gripping Hervey by his coat. The mariner looked down on the anxious face of the plump little man with a grim smile. "I can tell you," said he, "as you can't figure out the business unless I'm on the racket. No, sir, I'm the white boy in Thin Circus." The professor shook the lean sailor in his anxiety. "Who is he?" "That almighty aristocrat that came on board my ship when I lay in the Thames on the very afternoon I arrived with Bolton." "Who do you mean?" demanded Braddock, more and more perplexed. "Sir Frank Random." "What? Did he kill Bolton and steal my mummy? And hide it in that garden on his way to the fort? I guess he did." The professor sat down and closed his eyes with horror. When he opened them again, Hervey was gone. Chapter 16. The manuscript again. But the professor was not going to let Captain Hervey escape without giving him full information. Before the Yankee skipper could reach the front door, Braddock was at his heels, gasping and blowing like a grampus. Come back, tell me all." "I reckon not," rejoined the mariner, removing Braddock's grip. "You ain't the one to give the money. I'll go to the Don or to Inspector Date of Pierside." "But Sir Frank must be innocent," insisted Braddock. "He's got to prove it," was the dry response. "Let me go." "No, you must tell me on what grounds." "Oh, the devil take you," said Hervey hastily, and sat down on one of the hall chairs. "It's this way, since you won't let me skip until I tell you. This almighty aristocrat came to Pierside on the same afternoon as I cast anchor. While Bolton was on board, he looked in to have a yarn of sorts." "What about?" "Now, how in creation should I know?" snapped the skipper. "I wasn't on hand, as I'd enough to do with unloading cargo. but his lordship went with Bolton to the stateroom, and they talked for half an hour. When they came out, I saw that his lordship had his hair riz and heard him saying things to Bolton. What sort of things? Well, for one, he said, back quote, "You'll repent of this," and then again, back quote, "Your life isn't safe while you keep it." Meaning the mummy? I reckon that's so, unless I am mistaken, said Hervey serenely. Why didn't you go to the police with this information? Me? Not much. Why, I saw no way of making dollars. And then, again, I did not think of putting things together until I found that his lordship, meaning Sir Frank, interpolated the professor, frowning. I'm talking queens, or kings, or Republican lingo, I guess. And I do mean his lordship, said the skipper dryly, until I found that his lordship had been in the public house where the crime was committed. The Sailor's Rest? When did he go there? In the evening, after his talk with Bolton and after a row, as they both seemed to have their hair off, he skipped over the side and went back to his yacht, which wasn't far away. Bolton took his blamed mummy ashore and got fixed at the Sailor's Rest. I gathered afterwards from the second mate of the Diver, which ain't my ship now, that his lordship came into the hotel and had a drink. Afterwards, my second mate saw him talking to Bolton through the window. In the same place as the woman talked? Questioned the professor. That's so, only it was later in the evening that the woman came along to give chin music through the window. I am bound to say, added the captain generously, that no one I can place my hand on saw his lordship loafing about the hotel after dark, but what of that? He may have laid his plans and arranged for the corpse to be found later, in that blamed packing case. Is this all your evidence? It's enough, I guess. Not to procure a warrant. Why, a man in the States would be electrocuted on half the evidence. I dare say, retorted the little man with contempt, but we are in a land where justice of the purest prevails. All your evidence is circumstantial. It proves nothing. The captain was considerably nettled. I calculate that it proves Sir Frank wanted the mummy. Else why did he come on board my ship to see your infernal assistant? The words he used showed that he was warning Bolton how he'd do for him. And then he talked through the window and was in the public house, which ain't a place for an almighty aristocrat to shelter in. I guess he's the man wanted by the police. Why? Added Hervey, warming to his tale. He'd a slap-up yacht laying near the blamed hotel and could easily ship the corpse after slipping it through the window. When he got tired of it and looted the emeralds, he took it by boat below the fort to Mrs. Jasher's garden and left it there, so as to pull the wool over the eyes of the police. It's as clear as mud to me. You search his lordship's shanty, and you'll find the emeralds. It is strange, muttered Braddock unwillingly. Strange, but not true, said a voice from the head of the stairs, and young Hope came down leisurely, with a pale face but a very determined air. Random is absolutely innocent. How do you know? Demanded the skipper contemptuously. Because he is an English gentleman and my very good friend. Huh! I guess that defense won't save him from being lynched. Meanwhile, Braddock was looking irritably at Archie. You've been listening to a private conversation, sir. How dare you listen? If you hold private conversations at the top of your voices in the hall, you must be expected to be listened to, said Archie coolly. I plead guilty and I am not sorry. When did you come? In time to hear all that Captain Hervey has explained. I was chatting with Lucy and had just left her when I heard your loud voices. Has Lucy heard anything? No, she is busy in her room. But I'll tell her. Hope turned to mount the stairs. She likes Random and will no more believe him guilty than I do at this present moment. Stop! Cried Braddock, flying forward to pull Hope back as he placed his foot on the first stair. Tell Lucy nothing just now. We must go to the fort, you, and I to see Random. Hervey, you come also, and then you can accuse Sir Frank to his face. If he dares to do it, said Archie, who looked and felt indignant. Oh, I'll accuse him right enough when the time comes, said Hervey in his coolest manner. But the time isn't now. Savvy! I am going to see the Don first and make sure of this reward. Faugh! Cried Hope with disgust. Blood money! What of that? If some man is a murderer, he should be lynched. My friend, Sir Frank Random, is no murderer. He's got to prove that, as I said before, rejoined the Yankee in a calm way, and strolled to the door. So long, gents both. I'll light out for the Warrior Inn and play my cards. And I may tell you," he added, pausing at the door, which he opened, "that I haven't got that blamed windjammer, so need money to hold out until another steamer comes along. £100 English currency will just fill the bill. So now you know the lay I'm on. So long." Quote. And he walked quietly out of the house, leaving Archie and Braddock looking at one another with pale faces. The assurance of Hervey surprised and horrified them. Still, they could not believe that Sir Frank Random had been guilty of so brutal a crime. "For one thing," said Hope after a pause, "Random did not know where the emeralds were to be found, or even that they existed." "I understood that he did know," said Braddock reluctantly. "In my hearing and in your own, you heard Don Pedro state that he had related the story of the manuscript to Random." "You forget that I learned about the emeralds at the same time," said Hope quietly. "Yet this Yankee skipper does not accuse me. The knowledge of the emeralds came to Random's ears and to mine long after the crime was committed. To have a motive for killing Bolton and stealing the emeralds, Random would have had to know when he arrived in England." "And why should he have not known?" asked the professor, biting his lip vexedly. "I don't want to accuse Random, or even to doubt him, as he is a very good fellow, even though he refused to assist me with money when I desired a reward to be offered. All the same, he met Don Pedro in Genoa, and it is just possible that the man told him of the jewels buried with the mummy." Archie shook his head. "I doubt that," said he thoughtfully. "Random was as astonished as the rest of us when Don Pedro told his Arabian Night story. However, the point can be easily settled by sending for Random. I dare say he is at the fort." "I shall send Cockatoo for him at once," said the professor quickly, and walked into the museum to instruct the Kanaka. Archie remained where he was and seated himself on a chair, with folded arms and knitted brows. It was incredible that an English gentleman with a stainless name and such a well-known soldier should commit so terrible a crime. And the matter of Hervey's accusation was complicated by the fact, of which Hervey was ignorant, that Don Pedro was willing that Random should become his son-in-law. Hope wondered what the fiery, proud Peruvian would say when he heard his friend denounced. His reflections on this point were cut short by the return of the professor, who appeared at the door of the museum dismissing Cockatoo. When the Kanaka took his departure, Braddock beckoned to the young man. "There is no reason why we should talk in the hall and let the whole house know of this new difficulty," he said in a testy manner. "Come in here." Hope entered and looked with ill-concealed repugnance at the uncanny shape of the green mummy, which was lying on a long table. He examined the portions where the swathings had been cut with some sharp instrument, to reveal the dry, bony hands which formerly had held the costly jewels. The face was invisible and covered with a mask of dull, beaten gold. Formerly the eyes had been jeweled, but these last were now absent. He pointed out the mask to the professor, who was hovering over the weird dead with a large magnifying glass. "It is strange," said Hope earnestly, "that the mask of gold was not stolen also, since it is so valuable." "Unless melted down, the mask could be traced," said Braddock after a pause. "The jewels, according to Don Pedro, are of immense value, and so could have been got rid of easily. Random was satisfied with those." "Don't talk of him in that way, as though his guilt was certain," said Hope, wincing. "Well, you must admit that the evidence against him is strong, but purely circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence has hanged many an innocent man before now." Said Braddock uneasily. "I hope it won't hang our friend. However, we shall hear what he has to say. I have sent Cockatoo to the fort to bring him here at once. If Random is absent, Cockatoo is to leave a note in his room on the writing table. Would it not have been better to have told Cockatoo to give the note to Random's servant?" "I think not," responded Braddock dryly. "Random's servant is certainly one of the most stupid men in the entire army. He would probably forget to give him the note, and as it is important that we should see Random at once, it is better that he should find it placed personally on his writing table by Cockatoo, upon whom I can depend." Archie abandoned the argument, as it really mattered very little. He took up another line of conversation. "I expect if the criminal tries to dispose of the emeralds he will be caught," said he. "Such large jewels are too noticeable to escape comment." It depends upon the cleverness of the thief," said the professor, who was more taken up with the mummy than with the conversation. He might have the jewels cut into smaller stones, or he might go to India and dispose of them to some Raja, who would certainly say nothing. I don't know how criminals act myself, as I have never studied their methods. But I hope that the clue you mention will be hit upon, if only for Random's sake. I don't believe for one moment that Random is in danger, said Archie, and if he is, I shall turn detective myself. I wish you joy, replied Braddock, bending over the mummy. Look, Hope, at the wonderful color of this wool. There are some arts we have lost completely, dying of this surprising beauty as one. Humph, mused the archaeologist. I wonder why this particular mummy is dyed green, or rather why it is wrapped in green bandages. Yellow was the royal color of the ancient Peruvian monarchs. Vacuna wool dyed yellow. What do you think, Hope? It is strange. Archie shrugged his shoulders. I can say nothing, because I know nothing, he said sharply. All I do know is that I wish this precious mummy had never been brought here. It has caused trouble ever since its arrival. Well, said Braddock, surveying the dead with some disfavor, I must say that I shall be glad to see the last of it myself. I know now all that I wanted to know. Humph. I wonder if Don Pedro will allow me to strip the mummy. Of course. It is mine, not his. I shall unswathe it entirely. And Braddock was about to lay sacrilegious hands on the dead, when Cockatoo entered breathlessly. He had been so quick that he must have run to the fort and back again. I knock at door, said the Kanaka, delivering his message, and I hear no voice. I go in and find no one, so I put the letter on the table. I come down and ask, and a soldier tells me, Sir, his master is coming back in half an hour. You should have waited, said Braddock, waving Cockatoo aside. Come along with me to the fort, Hope. But Random will come here as soon as he returns. Very likely, but I can't wait. I am anxious to hear what he has to say in his defense. Come, Cockatoo. My coat, my hat, my gloves. Stir yourself, you scoundrel. Archie was not unwilling to go, since he was anxious also to hear what Random would say to the absurd accusation brought against him by the Yankee. In a few minutes the two men were walking smartly down the road through the village, the professor striving to keep up with Hope's longer legs by trotting as hard as he could. Halfway down the village they met a trap, and in it Captain Hervey being driven to the Jessam railway station. Have you seen Don Pedro? Asked the professor, stopping the vehicle. I reckon not, answered Hervey stolidly. He's gone into Pierside to see the police. I'm off there also. You had better come with us, said Archie sternly. We are going to see Sir Frank Random. Give him my respects, said the skipper cold-bloodedly, and say that he's worth £100 to me. He waved his hand and the trap moved away, but he looked back with a wry smile. Say I'll square the matter for double the money and command of his yacht. Braddock and Archie looked after the trap in disgust. What a scoundrel the man is, said the professor pettishly. He'd sell his father for what he could get. It shows how much his word is to be depended upon. I expect this accusation of Random is a put-up job. I hope so, for Random's sake, said Braddock, trotting briskly along. In a short time they arrived at the fort and were informed that Sir Frank had not yet returned, but was expected back every moment. In the meanwhile, as Braddock and Hope were both extremely well known, they were shown into Random's quarters, which were on the first floor. When the soldier servant retired and the door was closed, Hope seated himself near the window, while Braddock trotted round, looking into things. It's a dog kennel, said the professor. I told Random that. Perhaps we should have waited him in the mess, suggested Archie. No. We couldn't talk there, with a lot of silly young fools hanging about. I told Random that I would never enter the mess, so he invited me to come always to his quarters. He was in love with Lucy then, chuckled the professor, and nothing was too good for me. Not even the dog kennel, said Hope dryly, for the professor's chatter was so rude as to be quite annoying. Pooh. Random doesn't mind a joke. You, Hope, have no sense of humor. Your name is Scotch also. I believe you are a Caledonian. I am nothing of the sort. I was born on this side of the border. You might have been born at the North Pole for all I care, said the little man politely. I don't like artists. They are usually silly. I wish Lucy had married a man of science. Now, don't talk rubbish. I know what you are going to say. Well, said Archie, humoring him, what am I going to say? This nonplussed the irritable savant. I don't know and don't care. Poof! How hot this room is. What a number of books of travel Random has. Braddock was now at the bookcase, which consisted of shelves swung by cords against the wall. Random travels a great deal, Archie reminded him. Quite so, quite so. Wastes his money on that silly yacht. But he hasn't traveled in South America. I expect he's going there. Come here, Hope, and see the many, many books about Peru and Chile and Brazil. There must be a dozen, and all library books, too. Archie sauntered towards the shelves. I expect Random is getting up the subject of South America so as to talk to Donna Inez. Probably, snapped Braddock, pulling several of the books out of place. Why, there isn't a... Ah, dear me, what a catastrophe. He might well say so, for in his desire to examine the books, they all tipped off the shelves and lay in a disorderly heap on the floor. Hope began to pick them up and replace them, and so did the author of the mischief. Among the books were several papers scribbled with notes, and Braddock bundled these all in a heap. Shortly, he caught sight of the writing on one. "Hello, Latin," said he, "and read a line or two." "Oh," he gasped. "Hope, Hope, the manuscript of Don Pedro." "Impossible!" Archie rose and stared at the discolored paper. "Sorry to have kept you," said Random, entering at this moment. "You villain!" shouted Braddock furiously. "So you are guilty after all?" Chapter 17. Circumstantial Evidence. Random was so taken aback by the fierce accusation of the professor that he stood suddenly still at the door and did not advance into the room. Yet he did not look so much afraid as puzzled. Whatever Braddock might have thought, Hope, from the expression on the young soldier's face, was more than ever satisfied of his innocence. "What are you talking about, Professor?" asked Random, genuinely surprised. "You know well enough," retorted the professor. "Upon my word I don't," said the other, walking into the room and unbuckling his sword. "I find you here with the contents of my bookcase on the floor, and you promptly accuse me of being guilty. Of what, I should like to know? Perhaps you can tell me, Hope." "There is no need for Hope to tell you, sir. You are perfectly well aware of your own villainy." Random frowned. "I allow a certain amount of latitude to my guess, Professor," he said with marked dignity. "But for a man of your age and position, you go too far. Be more explicit." "Allow me to speak," intervened Archie, anticipating Braddock. "Random, the professor has just had a visit from Captain Hiram Hervey, who was the skipper of the Diver. He accuses you of having murdered Bolton." "What?" The baronet started back, looking thunderstruck. "Wait a moment. I have not finished yet. Hervey accuses you of this murder, of stealing the mummy, of gaining possession of the emeralds, and of placing the rifled corpse in Mrs. Jasher's garden so that she might be accused of committing the crime." "Exactly," cried Braddock, seeing that his host remained silent from sheer surprise. "Hope has stated the case very clearly. Now, sir, your defense?" "Defense! Defense!" Random found his tongue at last and spoke indignantly. "I have no defense to make." "Ah, then you acknowledge your guilt?" "I acknowledge nothing. The accusation is too preposterous for any denial to be necessary. Do you believe this of me?" He looked from one to the other. "I don't," said Archie quickly. "There is some mistake." "Thank you, Hope. And you, Professor?" Braddock fidgeted about the room. "I don't know what to think," he said at length. Hervey spoke very decisively. "Oh, indeed," returned Random dryly, and, walking to the door, he locked it. "In that case, I must ask you for an explanation, and neither of you shall leave this room until one is given. Your proofs?" "Here is one of them," snapped Braddock, throwing the manuscript on the table. "Where did you get this?" Random took up the discolored paper with a bewildered air. "I never set eyes on this before," he said, much puzzled. "What is it?" "A copy of the manuscript mentioned by Don Pedro, which describes the 2 emeralds buried with the mummy of Inca Caxes." "I see." Random understood all in a moment. "So you say that I knew of the emeralds from this, and so murdered Bolton to obtain them." "Pardon me," said Braddock with elaborate politeness. "Hervey says that you murdered my poor assistant, and although my discovery of this manuscript proves that you must have known about the jewels, I say nothing. I wait to hear your defense." "That's very good of you," remarked Sir Frank ironically. "So it seems that I am in the dock. Perhaps the counsel for the prosecution will state the evidence against me." And he looked again from one to the other. Archie shook the baronet by the hand very warmly. "My dear fellow," he declared decidedly, "I don't believe one word of the evidence." "In that case, there must be a flaw in it," retorted Random, but did not seem to be unmoved by Hope's generous action. "Sit down, Professor. It appears that you are against me." "Until I hear your defense," said the old man obstinately. "I cannot make any until I hear your evidence." "Go on." "I am waiting." And Sir Frank flung himself into a chair, where he sat calmly, his eyes steadily fixed on the professor's face. "Where did you get that manuscript?" asked Braddock sharply. "I got it nowhere. This is the first time I have seen it." "Yet it was hidden amongst your books." "Then I can't say how it got there. Were you looking for it?" "No, certainly not. To pass the time while waiting, I examined your library, and in pulling out a book, your case, being a swing one, overbalanced and shot its contents onto the floor. Amongst the papers which fell with the books, I caught a glimpse of the manuscript, and, noting that it was written in Latin, I picked it up, surprised to think that a frivolous young man, such as you are, should study a dead language. A few words showed me that the manuscript was a copy of the one referred to by Don Pedro. "One moment," said Archie, who had been thinking. "Perhaps this is the original manuscript, which de Gallegos has given to you, Random." "It is good of you to afford me a loophole of escape," said Sir Frank, leaning back with folded arms, "but de Gallegos gave me nothing. I saw the manuscript in his hands when he showed it to us all at Mrs. Jasher's. But whether this is the original or a copy, I can't say. Don Pedro certainly did not give it to me." "Has Don Pedro been in your quarters?" asked Hope, thoughtfully. "No. He has only visited me in the mess. And even if Don Pedro did come in here, for I guess what is in your mind, I really do not see why he should slip a manuscript which he values highly amongst my books." "Then you really never saw this before?" said Braddock, indicating the paper on the table, and impressed by Random's earnestness. "How often do you want me to deny it?" retorted the young man impatiently. "Perhaps you will state on what grounds I am accused." Braddock nodded and cleared his throat. "Captain Hervey declared that your yacht arrived at Pierside almost at the same time as his steamer." "Quite right. When Don Pedro received a wire from Malta stating that the mummy had been sold to you, and that it was being shipped to London on the Diver, I got up steam at once and chased the tramp to that port. As the tramp was slow and my boat was fast, I arrived on the same day and almost at the same hour, even though Hervey's boat had the start of mine." "Why were you anxious to follow the Diver?" asked Hope. "Don Pedro wished to get back the mummy and asked me to follow. As I was in love with Donna Inez, and still am, I was only too willing to oblige him." Braddock nodded again. "Hervey says that you went on board the Diver and had an interview with Bolton. That is perfectly true, and my visit was paid for the same reason as I followed the steamer to London. That is, I acted on behalf of Don Pedro. I wished to ascertain for certain that the mummy was on board, and having done so from Bolton, I urged him to induce you to give back the same free of charge to de Gallegos, from whom it had been stolen. He refused, as he declared that he intended to deliver it to you." "I knew I could always trust Bolton," said the professor enthusiastically. "It would have been better for you to have come to me, Random." "I dare say, but I wished, as I told you, to make certain that the mummy was on board. That was the real reason for my visit. But, being in Bolton's company, I naturally told him that Don Pedro claimed the mummy as his property, and warned him that if you or he kept the same, that there would be trouble." "Did you use threats?" asked Hope, remembering what he had overheard. "No, certainly not." "Yes, you did," cried Braddock quickly. "Hervey declares that you told Bolton that he would repent of keeping the mummy, and that his life would not be safe while he held it." To the surprise of both visitors, Random admitted using these serious threats without a moment's hesitation. "Don Pedro told me that many Indians, both in Lima and Cusco, who look upon him as the lawful descendant of the last Inca, are anxiously expecting the return of the royal mummy. He also stated that when the Indians knew who held the mummy, they would send one of themselves to get it back, if he, Don Pedro, that is, did not fetch it. To get back the mummy, Don Pedro declared that these Indians would not stop short of murder, hence my warning to Bolton. Oh, Archie jumped up with widely opened eyes. Then perhaps this solves the problem. Bolton was murdered by some Peruvian Indian. Random shook his head gravely. Again, you offer me a loophole of escape, my dear fellow, he said sententiously, but that theory will not hold water. At present, the Indians in Lima and Cusco do not know that the mummy has been found. Don Pedro only chanced upon the paper, which announced the sale by accident, and had no time to communicate with his barbaric friends in South America. Failing to get the mummy from you, Professor, he would have returned to Peru and then would have told who possessed the corpse of Inca Caxus, leaving the Indians to deal with the matter. In that case, my warning to Bolton would be necessary, but at the time I told him, it was not necessary. However, Bolton remained true to you, Professor, and declined to surrender the mummy. I therefore wired to Don Pedro at Genoa that the mummy was on board the diver and was being sent to Gartley. I also advised him to come to me here in order to be introduced to you. The rest you know. There was a moment's silence. Then Archie, to test if Random was willing to admit everything, as an innocent man certainly would, asked significantly, "Did you see Bolton again after your interview on board ship?" It was then that the baronet proved his good faith. "Oh, yes," he said easily and without hesitation. "I was walking about Pierside later, and passing along that waterside alley near the Sailor's Rest, I saw a window on the ground floor open and Bolton looking out across the river. I stopped and asked him when he proposed to take the mummy to Gartley, and if it was on shore. He admitted that it was in the hotel, but declined to say when he would send it on to you, Professor. When he closed the window, I afterwards went into the hotel and had a drink in order to ask casually when Mr. Bolton intended to leave. I gathered, not directly of course, but in a roundabout way, that he had arranged to go next morning and to send on his luggage. Then I left and went to London. In the course of time, I returned here and learned of the murder and the disappearance of the corpse of Inca Caxus. And now," Random stood up. "Having admitted all this, perhaps you will believe me to be innocent." "You have no idea who murdered Bolton and placed his body in the packing case?" asked Braddock, manifestly disappointed. No more than I have any idea of the person who placed the mummy case and its contents in Mrs. Jasher's garden." "Oh, you know that," said Archie quickly. "Yes. The news was all over the village this morning. I could hardly help knowing it. And I believe that the mummy has been taken to your house, Professor." "It has," admitted Braddock dryly. "I took it myself from Mrs. Jasher's arbor in a handcart, with the assistance of Cockatoo. But when I made an examination this morning in the presence of Hope and Don Pedro, I found that the swathings of the body had been ripped up, and that the emeralds mentioned in that manuscript had been stolen." "Strange," said Random with a frown. "And by whom?" "No doubt by the assassin of Sidney Bolton." "Probably." Random kicked a mat straight with his foot. "At any rate, the theft of the emeralds shows that it was not any Indian who killed Bolton. None of them would rifle so sacred a corpse. Besides which, as you say, the Indians in Peru do not know that the mummy has reappeared after 30 years, seclusion," chimed in Hope, rising. "Well, and what is to be done now?" For answer, Sir Frank picked up the manuscript, which still remained on the table. "I shall see Don Pedro about this," he said quietly, "and ascertain if it is the original or a copy." Braddock rose slowly and stared at the paper. "Do you know Latin?" he asked. "No," rejoined Random, knowing what the savant meant. "I learned it, of course, but I have forgotten much. I might translate a word or two, but certainly not the hedge priest Latin in which this is written." He looked carefully at the manuscript as he spoke. "But who could have placed it in your room?" questioned Archie. "We cannot learn that until we see Don Pedro. If this is the original manuscript which we saw the other night, we may learn how it passed from the possession of de Gallegos to my bookcase. If it is a copy, then we must learn, if possible, who owned it." Don Pedro said that a transcript or a translation had been made, mentioned Hope. "Evidently a transcript," said Braddock, glaring at the paper in Random's hand. "But how could that find its way from Lima to this place?" "It might have been packed up with the mummy," suggested Archie. "No," contradicted Random decisively. In that event, the man in Malta from whom the mummy was bought would have discovered the emeralds and would have taken them. Perhaps he did. We have nothing to show that Bolton's assassin committed the crime for the sake of the jewels. He must have done so, cried the professor irritably, else there is no motive for the commission of the crime. But I think myself that we must start at the other end, to find a clue. When we discover who placed the mummy in Mrs. Jasher's garden. That will not be easy, murmured Hope thoughtfully, though, of course, the same must have been brought by river. Let us go down to the embankment and see if there are any signs of a boat having been brought there last night. And he moved to the door. Random? I cannot leave the fort as I am on duty, replied the officer, putting the manuscript away in a drawer and locking the same. But this evening I shall see Don Pedro, and in the meanwhile I shall endeavor to learn from my servant who visited me lately while I was absent. The manuscript must have been brought here by someone. But I trust, he added as he escorted his two visitors to the door, that you now acquit me of— Yes, cried Braddock, hastily cutting him short and shaking his hand. I apologize for my suspicions. Now I maintain that you are innocent. And I never believed you to be guilty, cried Hope heartily. Thank you both, said Random simply, and, having closed the door, he returned to a chair near the fire to smoke a pipe and meditate over his future movements. An enemy hath done this, quote, said Random, referring to the concealment of the manuscript, but he could think of no one who desired to harm him in any way. Chapter 18. Recognition. Lucy and Mrs. Jasher were having a confidential conversation in the small, pink drawing room. True to her promise, Miss Kendall had come to readjust matters between the fiery little professor and the widow. But it was not an easy task, as Mrs. Jasher was righteously indignant at the rash words used to her. As if I knew anything about the matter, she repeated again and again in angry tones. Why, my dear, he as good as told me I had murdered. Lucy did not let her finish. There, she said, speaking as she would have done to a fretful child. You know what my father is. It seems to me that I am just beginning to learn, said the widow bitterly, and knowing how ready he is to believe ill of me, I think it is better we should part forever. But you'll never be Lady Braddock. Even if I married him, I am not sure that I should be, since I learn that his brother is singularly healthy and comes of a long-lived family. And it will not be pleasant to live with your father when he has such a temper. That was only because he was excited. Think of your salon and of the position you wish to hold in London. Ah, well, said Mrs. Jasher, visibly softening, there is something to be said there. After all, one can never find a man who is perfection. And a very amiable man is usually a fool. One can't expect a rose to be without thorns. But really, my dear, she surveyed Lucy with mild surprise, you appear to be very anxious that I should marry your father. I want to see my father made comfortable before I marry Archie, said the girl with a blush. Of course, my father is quite a child in household affairs and needs everything done for him. Archie, I am glad to say, is now in a position to marry me in the spring. I want you to be married about the same time, and then you can live in Gartley and— No, my dear, said Mrs. Jasher firmly, if I marry your father, he wishes us to go at once to Egypt in search of this tomb. I know that he wants you to help with the money left to you by your late brother, but surely you will not go up the Nile yourself? No, certainly not, said the widow promptly. I shall remain in Cairo while the professor goes on his excursion into Ethiopia. I know that Cairo is a very charming place, and that I shall be able to enjoy myself there. Then you have decided to forgive my father for his rash words? I must, sighed Mrs. Jasher. I am so tired of being an unprotected widow without a recognized position in the world. Even with my brother's money, not that it is so very much, I shall still be looked upon askance if I go into society. But as Mrs. Braddock, or Lady Braddock, no one will dare to say a word against me. Yes, my dear, if your father comes and asks my pardon, he shall have it. We women are so weak, ended the widow virtuously, as if she was not making a virtue of necessity. Things being thus settled, the two talked on amiably for some time and discussed the chances of Random marrying Donna Inez. Both acknowledged that the Peruvian lady was handsome enough, but had not a word to say for herself. While thus chattering, Professor Braddock trotted into the room, looking brisk and bright from his stroll in the cold, frosty air. Gifted as he was with scientific assurance, the little man was not at all taken aback by the cold reception of Mrs. Jasher, but rubbed his hands cheerfully. "Ah, there you are, Selina," said he, looking like a bright-eyed robin. "I hope you are feeling well." "How can you expect me to feel well after what you said?" remarked Mrs. Jasher reproachfully, and anxious to make a virtue of forgiveness. "Oh, I beg pardon, I beg pardon. Surely, Selina, you are not going to make a fuss over a trifle like that?" "I did not give you permission to call me Selina." "Quite so, but as we are to be married, I may as well get used to your Christian name, my dear." "I am not so sure that we will be married," said Mrs. Jasher stiffly. "Oh, but we must," cried Braddock in dismay. "I am depending upon your money to finance my expedition to Queen Tahoser's tomb." "I see," observed the widow coldly, while Lucy sat quietly by and allowed the elder woman to conduct the campaign. "You want me for my money. There is no love in the question. My dear, as soon as I have the time, say during our voyage to Cairo, once we start inland up the Nile for Ethiopia, I shall make love whenever you like. And, confound it, Selina, I admire you no end, to use a slang phrase. You are a fine woman and a sensible woman, and I am afraid that you are throwing yourself away on a snuffy old man like myself." "Oh, no, no, pray do not say that," cried Mrs. Jasher, visibly moved by this flattery. "You will make a very good husband if you will only strive to govern your temper." "Temper, temper, bless the woman. I mean you, Selina. I have the very best temper in the world. However, you shall govern it, and myself also, if you like. Come," he took her hand, "let us be friends and fix the wedding day." Mrs. Jasher did not withdraw her hand. "Then you do not believe that I have anything to do with this terrible murder?" she asked playfully. "No, no, I was heated last night. I spoke rashly and hastily. Forgive and forget, Selina. You are innocent, quite innocent, in spite of the mummy being in your confounded garden. After all, the evidence is stronger against Random than against you. Perhaps he put it there. It's on his way to the fort, you see. Never mind. He has exonerated himself, and no doubt, when confronted with Harvey, will be able to silence that blackguard. And I am quite sure that Harvey is a blackguard," ended Braddock, rubbing his bald head. The two ladies looked at one another in amazement, not knowing what to say. They were ignorant of the theft of the emeralds, and of the accusation of Sir Frank by the Yankee skipper. But, with his usual absent-mindedness, Braddock had forgotten all about that, and sat in his chair, rubbing his head quite pink, and rattling on cheerfully. "I went down with Hope to the embankment," he continued, "but neither of us could see any sign of a boat. There's the rude, short jetty, of course, and if a boat came, a boat could go away without leaving any trace. Perhaps that is so. However, we must wait until we see Don Pedro and Harvey again, and then—" Lucy broke in desperately. "What are you talking about, Father? Why do you bring in Sir Frank's name in that way?" "What do you expect me to say?" retorted the little man. "After all, the manuscript was found in his room, and the emeralds are gone. I saw that for myself, as did Hope and Don Pedro, in whose presence I opened the mummy case." Mrs. Jasher rose in her astonishment. "Are the emeralds gone?" she gasped. "Yes, yes, yes," cried Braddock irritably. "Am I not telling you so? I almost believe in Hervey's accusation of Random, and yet the boy exonerated himself very forcibly indeed." "Will you explain all that has happened, Father?" said Lucy, who was becoming more and more perplexed by this rambling chatter. "We are quite in the dark." "So am I, so is Hope, so is everyone," chuckled Braddock. "Ah, yes, of course you were not present when these events took place." "What events? What events?" demanded Mrs. Jasher, now quite exasperated. "I'm about to tell you," snapped her future husband, and related all that had taken place since the arrival of Captain Hervey in the museum at the pyramids. The women listened with interest and with growing astonishment, only interrupting the narrator with a simultaneous exclamation of indignation when they heard that Sir Frank was accused. "It is utterly and wholly absurd," cried Lucy angrily. "Sir Frank is the soul of honor." "So I think, my dear," chimed in Mrs. Jasher. "And what does he say to—" Braddock interrupted. "I'm about to tell you, if you will stop talking," he cried crossly. "That is so like a woman. She asks for an explanation and then prevents the man from giving it. Random offers a very good defense, I am bound to say. And he detailed what Sir Frank had said. When the history was finished, Lucy rose to go. "I shall see Archie at once," she said, moving hastily towards the door. "What for?" demanded her father benignly. Lucy turned. "This thing can't go on," she declared resolutely. "Mrs. Jasher was accused by you, father." "Only in a heated moment," cried the professor, excusing himself. "Never mind, she was accused," retorted Lucy stubbornly. "And now this sailor accuses Sir Frank. Who knows who will be charged next with committing the crime? I shall ask Archie to take the matter up and hunt down the real criminal. Until the guilty person is found, I foresee that we shall never have a moment's peace." "I quite agree with you," said Mrs. Jasher earnestly. "For my own sake, I wish the matter of this mystery to be cleared up. Why don't you help me?" she added, turning to Braddock, who listened placidly. "I am helping," said Braddock quietly. "I intend to set Cockatoo on the trail at once. He shall take up his abode in the Sailor's Rest on some pretext, and no doubt will be able to find a clue." "What?" cried the widow incredulously. "A savage like that?" "Cockatoo is much cleverer than the average white man," said Braddock dryly, "especially in following a trail. He, if anyone, will learn the truth. I would much rather trust the Kanaka than young Hope." "Nonsense," cried Lucy, standing up for her lover. "Archie is the one to discover the assassin. I'll see him at once. And you, father?" "I, my dear," said the professor calmly, "shall remain here and make my peace with the future Mrs. Braddock." "You have made it already," said the widow graciously, and extended her hand, which the professor kissed unexpectedly, and then sat back in his chair, looking quite abashed at his outburst of gallantry. Seeing that everything was going well, Lucy left the elderly couple to continue their courting and hurried to Archie's lodgings in the village. However, he happened to be out, and his landlady did not know when he would return. Rather annoyed by this, since she greatly desired to unbosom herself, Miss Kendall walked disconsolately towards the pyramids. On the way, she was stopped by Widow Anne, looking more dismal and funereal than ever, and garrulous with copious draughts of gin. Not that she was intoxicated, but her tongue was loose, and she wept freely for no apparent reason. According to herself, she had stopped Lucy to demand back from Mr. Hope through the girl certain articles of attire which had been borrowed for artistic purposes. These, consisting of a shawl and a skirt and a bodice, were of extraordinary value, and Mrs. Bolton wanted them back or their equivalent in value. She mentioned that she would prefer the sum of £5. "Why do you not ask Mr. Hope yourself?" said Lucy, who was too impatient to bear with the old creature's maunderings. "If you gave him the things, he will no doubt return them." "If they aren't spiled with paint," wailed Widow Anne. "He told my Sid as he wanted them for a model to wear while being painted. Sid asked me, and I gave 'em to Sid, and Sid he passed 'em along to your good gentleman. There was a skirt as good as new, and a body of the dress trimmest beautiful, and a tartan shawl as I got from my mother. But no," the old woman corrected herself, "it was a dark shawl with red spots and—" "Ask Mr. Hope, ask Mr. Hope," cried Miss Kendall impatiently. "I know nothing about the things." And she tore her dress from Widow Anne's detaining hand to hurry home. Mrs. Bolton wailed aloud at this desertion, and took her way to Hope's lodgings, where she declared her determination to remain until the artist restored her apparel. Lucy for the moment thought little of this interview, but on reflection she thought it strange that Archie should borrow clothes from Mrs. Bolton through Sydney. Not that there was anything strange in Archie's procuring such garments, since he may have wanted them to clothe a model with, but he could easily have got such things from his landlady, or, if from Widow Anne, could have borrowed them direct, without appealing to Sydney. Why, then, had the dead man acted as an intermediate party? This question was hard to answer, yet Lucy greatly wished for a reply, since she suddenly remembered how a woman in a dark dress and with a dark shawl over her head had been seen by Eliza Flight, the housemaid of the Sailor's Rest, talking to Bolton through the window. Were the garments borrowed as a disguise? And did the person who had borrowed them desire that it should be supposed that Widow Anne was talking to her son? There was a chill hand clutching Lucy's heart as she went home, for the words of Mrs. Bolton seemed indirectly to implicate Hope in the mystery. She determined to ask him about the matter straight out, when he came in that night to pay his usual visit. At dinner, the professor was in excellent spirits and actually became so human as to compliment Lucy on her housekeeping. He also mentioned that he hoped Mrs. Jasher would cater as excellently. Over coffee, he informed his stepdaughter that he had entirely won the widow's heart by abasing himself at her feet and withdrawing the accusation. They had arranged to be married in May, 1 or 2 weeks after Lucy became Mrs. Hope. In the autumn, they would start for Egypt and would remain abroad for a year or more. "In fact," said the professor, setting down his cup and preparing to take his departure, "everything is now settled excellently. I marry Mrs. Jasher, you, my dear, marry Hope, and Sir Frank marries Donna Inez," finished Lucy quickly. "That," said Braddock stiffly, "entirely depends upon what De Gallegos says to this accusation of Hervey's. Sir Frank is innocent." "I hope so, and I believe so, but he will have to prove his innocence. I shall do my best, and I have sent round to Don Pedro to come here. We can then talk it over." "Can Archie and I come in also?" asked Miss Kendall anxiously. Somewhat to her surprise, the professor yielded a ready assent. "By all means, my dear. The more witnesses we have, the better it will be. We must do all in our powers to bring this matter to a successful issue." So things were arranged, and when Archie came up to the drawing room, Lucy informed him that Braddock was in the museum with Don Pedro, telling all that had happened. Hope was glad to hear that Lucy had secured the professor's consent that they should be present, for the mystery of Bolton's terrible death was piquing him, and he dearly desired to learn the truth. As a matter of fact, although he was unaware of it, he was suffering from an attack of detective fever and wished to solve the mystery. He therefore went gladly into the museum with his sweetheart. Oddly enough, as Lucy recollected, when it was too late to speak, she quite forgot to relate what Widow Anne had said about the borrowed clothes. Don Pedro, looking more stiff and dignified than ever, was in the museum with Braddock. The two men were seated in comfortable chairs, and Cockatoo, some distance away, was polishing with a cloth the green mummy case of the fatal object which had brought about all the trouble. Lucy had half expected to see Donna Inez, but De Gallegos explained that he had left her writing letters to Lima in the Warrior Inn. When Miss Kendall and Hope were seated, the Peruvian expressed himself much surprised at the charge which had been brought against Sir Frank. "If I can speak of such things in the presence of a lady," he remarked, bowing his head to Lucy. "Oh, yes," she answered eagerly. "I have heard all about the charge, and I am glad that you are here, Don Pedro, for I wish to say that I do not believe there is a word of truth in the accusation." "Nor do I," asserted the Peruvian decisively. I agree, cried Braddock, beaming. "And you, Hope?" "I never believed it, even before I heard Random's defense," said Archie with a dry smile. "Did you not see Captain Hervey yourself, sir?" he added, turning to Don Pedro. "He started for Pierside to look you up." "I have not seen him," said De Gallegos in his stately way, "and I am very sorry, as I desire to examine him about the accusation he had dared to bring against my very good friend, Sir Frank Random. I wish he were here at this very minute, so that I could tell him what I think of the charge." Just as Don Pedro spoke, the unexpected happened, as though some genie had obeyed his commands. As though transported into the room by magic, the American skipper appeared, not through the floor, but by the door. A female domestic admitted him and announced his name, then fled to avoid the anger of her master, seeing she had violated the sacred precincts of the museum. Captain Hervey, amused by the surprise visible on every face, sauntered forward, hat on head and cheroot in mouth as usual. But when he saw Lucy, he removed both with a politeness scarcely to be expected from so rude and ready and rough a mariner. "I beg pardon for coming here uninvited," said Hervey awkwardly, "but I've been chasing the Don all over Pierside and through this village. They told me at the police office that you," he spoke to De Gallegos, "had doubled on your trail, so here I am for a little private conversation." The Peruvian looked gravely at Hervey's face, which was clearly revealed in the powerful light of the many lamps with which the museum was filled, and rose to bow. "I am glad to see you, sir," he said politely, and with a still more searching glance. "With the permission of our host, I shall ask you to take a chair." And he turned to Braddock. "Certainly, certainly," said the professor fussily. "Cockatoo?" "Pardon, allow me," said de Guiangos, and brought forward a chair, still keeping his eyes on the skipper, who was rather confused by the courtesy. "Will you be seated, senor? Then we can talk." Hervey sat down quietly close to the Peruvian, who then leaned forward to address him. "You will have a cigarette?" he asked, offering a silver case. "Thanks, no, I'll smoke a cheroot if the lady don't mind." "Not at all," replied Lucy, who, along with Archie and the professor, was puzzled by Don Pedro's manner. "Please, smoke." In taking back the case, Don Pedro allowed it to drop. As he made no motion of picking it up, Hervey, although annoyed with himself for his politeness towards a yellow stomach, as he called de Guiangos, was compelled to stretch for it. As he handed it back to Don Pedro, the Peruvian's eyes lighted up, and he nodded gravely. "Thank you, Vasa," said de Guiangos, and Hervey, changing color, leaped from his seat as though touched by a spear point. And that's where we'll leave the story for today. Thank you for spending your time with Narrate the Tales. I'll see you in the next chapter.